Known for its lush landscapes and abundant wildlife, Central Virginia and the Blue Ridge Mountains have always been home to the Monacan Indian people. We have lived in this area for more than 10,000 years. This land is our land, Naha PP, and welcome to Monacan country. The heart of our community is at our Sacred Bear Mountain in Amherst, Virginia. Although we no longer wear our traditional clothing day to day, we still live our heritage and we continue to overcome hardships from the past. We welcome you to visit our museum and sacred lands. Come learn about our stories, share in our food, and experience our culture. We have always been here, ready to meet you, here in Monacan country.
Hi everyone. I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Nici Cumpston. I'm the director at Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection. And I'd just like to thank you all for coming today, and just to acknowledge that we have some very special guests here today who have joined us from a long way away. But I would also like to just speak for a moment about acknowledgement of country. Myself, I'm a Barkandji person from the Darling River, or the Barka as we call it, in Western New South Wales in Australia. And for us, our river, the Barka, is our mother, and our land is our mother. And we need to pay our respect and care for our country. All of us, every single one of us needs to do that, because we are all a part of this environment, and without a clean waterway, without clean air, we wouldn't survive. So the way that we think about acknowledging country is that we each take a responsibility by acknowledging where we are. We think about the First Peoples. We think about the fact that this country is still alive and very much, we are the responsible custodians now of this place. And so I'd just like to pay my deep respects to the Monacan Nation and to acknowledge that we are here today on their land, and just to, for us all to think about our own responsibility and the care that we need to take in looking after the country that we live on and that we travel on and visit. So thank you all for coming. It's really, truly wonderful to be able to have a chance to share today in this incredible symposium, the Nuclear Colonialism and the Art of Resistance. And I'd just like to acknowledge Eleanor Newman for all of the work that you've done in bringing us all together. It's big, and I also would like to just acknowledge the people who have supported this opportunity. So the UVA, University of Virginia Department of Art, the Centre for Global Inquiry and Innovation, and the University of Virginia Environmental Institute, and just to also acknowledge and thank the people who have worked, the Kluge-Ruhe staff who have all worked on this, including Eleanor, of course, and Nicole Wade, Laura Snyder, Jameson Daly, Jennifer Billingsley, and it's great to see so many of our interns here today, and including Emmy Monaghan as well. And also just to acknowledge Margot Smith, who's here, who of course worked on this prior to me, worked on this symposium, and of course was the director of Kluge-Ruhe for all that number of years. And just to thank you, Margot, for your legacy that you leave for us to continue this great work. And I'd also just like to thank our visiting speakers. I'm not going to introduce you properly. Eleanor's going to do that in a moment. But Greg Castillo is here with us. And Greg is also the donor of work whose work we have at the Kluge-Ruhe at the moment in the exhibition in the beginning, paintings from the Spinifex artists. So thank you for being here, Greg, and we look forward to hearing from you. Danielle Endres, thank you as well for coming all the way from Utah to be with us, and Will Wilson, who just arrived in the nick of time due to flight delays and what have you across the nation at the moment. And also our moderator this afternoon, Tiffany King, thank you so much for coming along and being here with us. And Georges Petitjean is here from the Fondation Opal. We are doing another exhibition with the Spinifex works from our collection and the works from the Fondation Opal for next year. That will be in Switzerland. Hopefully you'll be able to go and see that. And I'd also just like to acknowledge Katina Davidson, who was the visiting curator here at Kluge-Ruhe, who worked on the exhibition in the beginning as well. So thank you all for joining us, and without further ado, let's get on with it.
Hi, I'm Greg Castillo. Thank you all very much for being here. I'm just going to give a few brief words to frame the conversation we'll have today about nuclear colonialism, or maybe better put, nuclear decolonization through the art of resistance. In 1993, Indigenous rights scholars Ward Churchill and Winona LeDuc coined the term radioactive colonization to describe a Cold War order in which the toxic byproducts and socially traumatic outcomes of nuclear weapons production and testing disproportionately harmed First Nations homelands and their peoples. And then they were focusing on the consequences of uranium mining and bomb testing in the American Southwest, and they insisted that the public debate about nuclear industry fallout from mining and fuel processing and radioactive waste disposal all the way through nuclear weapons testing had consistently ignored its targeted devastation of native reservations and treaty-guaranteed and sacred lands. The fate of First Nations people was really physically and culturally at stake. Subsequent scholarship has confirmed the depredations of what is now generally called nuclear colonialism as it impacts Indigenous bodies and terrains worldwide. The radical asymmetry in power between First Nations communities and Cold War states not only made nuclear colonialism possible, but it also expunged public knowledge of its successes. And as a new generation of scholars map out the scope and outcomes of nuclear colonialism, Indigenous activists have increasingly turned to the arts to voice personal expressions of their collective nuclear experience and the terrible legacies of this moment in history. So our symposium, Nuclear Colonialism and the Art of Resistance, follows in the footsteps of some path-breaking exhibitions like Black Mist Burnt Country, Testing the Bomb, and also Exposure, Native Art and Political Ecology that was shown in Santa Fe. So our symposium really builds upon the show that's currently at the Kluge-Ruhe Museum that I hope people will have a chance to see again, even if you've seen it once before, in the beginning, The Art of the Spinifex People. And this was curated by Katina Davidson and features artists from the Spinifex Arts Project, and I'll address some of those works in my talk. So the synergies between that exhibition and this symposium on nuclear colonialism really is our attempt to sort of foreground Indigenous voices in what Danielle Endres has called a nuclear decolonization movement. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here on the lands of the Monacan Nation. And I have the great honor of introducing our speakers today. I'm Eleanor Newman, I'm curator at Kluge-Ruhe. We've got a really wonderful program, 2 speakers, a break for coffee, and if you haven't seen it, to watch Collisions, which is the VR experience over in the Scholars Lab, which is just right next door. So if you haven't seen it, there's time today to do that as well. And then our final 2 speakers, followed by a Q&A at the end, as we've mentioned. And I just also want to thank our speakers for taking the time away from their families and their very, very busy lives to be here, and also take great risk of flying this weekend with all of the all of the transportation troubles with the shutdown. So we're just really grateful to all be convening in the same room. We couldn't think of a better person to start the conversation today than Danielle Endres. She's a professor of communication and the director of the Environmental Humanities Program at the University of Utah. And her research areas are environmental communication, Indigenous communication, and rhetorical studies. Her research focuses on the rhetoric of environmental and science controversies, including nuclear waste siting decisions, climate change, and energy transitions. Her work is guided by principles of environmental justice and focuses on how underrepresented and marginalized groups, particularly Native peoples and nations, engage in environmental advocacy. She is the author of Nuclear Decolonization, Indigenous Resistance to High-Level Nuclear Waste Siting, among others. So you can imagine that she's the first person that we thought of to start this conversation. She's currently working on 2 really exciting projects that I hope you take the time to ask her about during our coffee break. And those include an analysis of energy justice campaigns in Puerto Rico and a collaborative project with the Northwestern Band of Shoshone to collect historical archives for the nation. Please join me in welcoming Danielle to the stage. Just this here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for hosting me. I want to particularly thank Eleanor for arranging my visit, and it's been so great to meet Greg and Nici and Will and everyone at the Kluge-Ruhe Museum. I also want to express my gratitude and respect for the Monacan Indian Nation, within whose ancestral and contemporary homelands were gathered. Being an uninvited guest to this continent and to these homelands includes a set of responsibilities to care for this place, as I would entering anyone's home. I also want to acknowledge the enslaved Africans, enslaved laborers, and free Black laborers who built UVA, where we're meeting today. One can't enter a new place without seeing the history and the power relations that constructed that place. I have to say, I love art. I'm not an artist and I'm not an art scholar, but it's really been a dream of mine since the beginning of this work to pair art and oral history about nuclear colonization and nuclear decolonization in a museum exhibit. Obviously, that was not my skill set to curate anything, but it was just so wonderful to be invited to be part of this and engage with curators and artists and all of the folks in this room who appreciate the power of art. So today I'll talk about nuclear decolonization, a form of rhetorical movement building towards Indigenous-led futures. This is a project that I worked on for over 20 years and involves close engagement with Nua and Nuuvi land protectors and their allies, which is all detailed in my book, Nuclear Decolonization. The book retells the stories of Indigenous anti-nuclear lands protectors who prevented 2 high-level nuclear waste sites from being sited on their lands. This is a story of successful resistance. We certainly need some of those these days. And it celebrates the brilliance of Indigenous rhetors who are building and pursuing futures without nuclear technologies. It's a form of resistance that refuses to stop at calling out the disproportionate destruction that Indigenous peoples worldwide have faced due to the settler pursuit of nuclear weapons testing and uranium mining and such. While never denying the need to resist nuclear colonization, nuclear decolonization shifts our focus to the brilliance and survivance of Indigenous peoples and nations. So as common when using Indigenous research methods, I want to begin with an introduction to myself and the places that are important to me in this project. So I'm a white settler woman living in what's now called the US. My ancestors came to this continent well before me, arriving as early as the 1600s and continuing through the 17 and 1800s from Germany, Sweden, Norway, Ireland, England, and Scotland. Although initially settled in the Northeast and Midwest regions of the continent, my ancestors and relatives settled and dispersed across many places as they arrived and homesteaded, followed jobs, and ventured away from family roots. I grew up and lived 18 years of my life in the homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone. My pursuit of higher education brought me to live and work in the homelands of Kumeyaay, Kalapua, and Duwamish peoples. Today, I live in Goshute, Northwestern Shoshone, Nua, Paiute, Nuuvi, and Ute Nooch homelands, which is now called the Salt Lake Valley, east of the Great Salt Lake. The Sosogi called that the Tich-i-Pagani. And Salt Lake Valley remains a gathering place for Indigenous peoples, as well as being the ancestral and traditional homelands of the aforementioned peoples. The state of Utah is named after the Ute Nation, although 8 distinct Indigenous nations border the state of Utah. There are 2.45 million acres of Indigenous land trust in Utah, which is about 4.5% of the total land base in Utah. I own property and I work at a university that occupies a portion of these lands, both of which afford me privileges as a settler. The University of Utah also uses the Utes name for its sports teams with permission from the Ute Indian tribe of the Uinta and Ouray Reservation. Beyond that personal history and my movement through this continent, the project is also grounded in very particular places. The project started when I lived in Duwamish lands and has continued in my time in Ute, Paiute, Shoshone, and Goshute lands. The project also entailed numerous visits to Western Shoshone, Skull Valley Goshute, and Southern Paiute lands, and visiting these places greatly enhanced my ability to do this work, not only because it facilitated conversations and participation, but also because I was able to see, feel, and be with the lands that were proposed to store high-level nuclear waste. My engagement with these places gave me a perspective that I could not have acquired through, need a little bit of light to read, that I could not have acquired through only written accounts, photos, and maps. Thank you. Engaging in place mattered for my ability to see why Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Goshute peoples and nations worked so hard to protect these lands against nuclear waste. So the primary theoretical framework for this work is nuclear decolonization. As noted on the slide, nuclear decolonization refers to Indigenous-led enactments of sovereignty and self-determination towards protecting relationships with lands, lifeways, and sacred practices from nuclear technologies. It's a mode of survivance and radical resurgence. It's an envisioning and enacting of nuclear-free futures for Indigenous peoples and nations. It's not only a set of rhetorical tactics, but it's also an Indigenous-led theory of social change. Nuclear decolonization is a counterstory to nuclear colonization, a concept created by Native lands protectors, or Churchill and Winona LaDuke, as Greg mentioned earlier, to describe how convergences of systems of nuclearism and settler colonialism disproportionately harm Indigenous peoples, their lands, and their lifeways throughout the cycle of nuclear technologies. Nuclear decolonization is a unique form of anti-nuclear lands protection that's based in an indigenized perspective on environmental justice that sees nuclearism not just as an issue of national security or energy security, but also of the ecological, cultural, and political health of Indigenous peoples and their kin. Kyle White contends that settler colonialism is an environmental injustice because it seeks to break Indigenous peoples and nations' connections with lands and more than human ecologies. Tactics of nuclear decolonization are in part rhetorics that resist environmental injustices that are faced by Indigenous peoples. These rhetorical tactics also draw from Indigenous environmentalisms that are built from the many traditional ecological knowledges that the over 500 Native communities on this continent share. So nuclear decolonization is hard work, and it has consequences for those who engage with it. I'll go into a little more detail about the communities I worked with in a moment, but I want to pause to reflect on one of the key people who informed my work. This is Margene Bull Creek, who unfortunately has now passed on. And this is an excerpt from the book where I talk about one of the meetings we had. Over a series of years, Margene Bull Creek, a Skull Valley Goshute elder, graciously hosted students from my environmental humanities class within her people's reservation lands. She spoke to us about her actions to resist the Skull Valley Goshute government's decision to pursue a partnership with private fuel storage for temporarily storing high-level nuclear waste on the lands. On one visit, a group of students and I gathered in a circle around Margene on a cold spring day. There were pockets of snow still on the ground, winter wind blowing through the desert landscape. And as we listened, Margine told us about her desire to share her story with non-Native people and her calling to navigate the space between what she called two roads, the Red Road and the White Road. She told us about the divide between the Skull Valley Nation government over pursuing nuclear waste storage as a form of economic development. She was firmly opposed to the nuclear waste site, opposing her own government's decision to pursue it, and told us how she had devoted her life to that work. She told us about the tensions between her and Leon Baer, the chair of the tribal council at the time, noting the proximity between her house and his on the small reservation. On another trip, while we spoke to Margine, we noticed a new large black truck driving up. The truck pulled up right next to where we stood. On the passenger side window opened, and the driver, that was the Skull Valley Go Shoot chairperson Leon Baer, looked at our group and asked, "What are you doing on the reservation?" I've never been a moment that more encapsulates that adage of one could cut the tension with a knife. Years later, I can still remember how that moment felt, the tension in the way that Margine and Leon looked at each other, the discomfort I felt, and the worry of potentially putting our host at risk by allowing us to visit her on the reservation. It was clear to me that Margine had taken a risk by letting us visit the reservation and telling her story to this group of predominantly white environmental humanities students. And this moment is one of many that really highlights the personal stakes of decolonization work for Indigenous peoples. So the work recounts the stories of Indigenous activism from the 1980s to the 2010s to prevent two high-level nuclear waste storage facilities from being built within Indigenous lands. The Yucca Mountain High-Level Nuclear Waste Repository within Southern Paiute and Western Shoshone lands, and the private fuel storage, as shown on the map, interim high-level nuclear waste facility within Skull Valley Go Shoot lands. The entire impact cycle of nuclear weapons, as I'm sure we'll hear more about today, and nuclear power produce various low and high-level wastes that, though they vary in intensity, are dangerous to human and more than human life. They are dangerous in some cases for up to 1 million years. High-level nuclear waste is the most radioactive and dangerous form. Nuclear waste is a material legacy of the nuclear technologies that must be safely contained. But nuclear waste is also entangled with rhetoric through justifications and arguments used over the years to justify what we should do and where we should put nuclear waste. Of course, the US needs a solution to nuclear waste, as do other countries that use nuclear powers. Those who are resisting nuclear waste sites don't deny this, but they argue from a break of the patterns of injustice wherein marginalized, underrepresented communities that don't have nuclear power or don't make their own nuclear weapons, are disproportionately selected for waste sites. So even though the US needs a solution, should the US ask Indigenous peoples, nations, and lands to carry this burden? And that's a central question that nuclear decolonization raises, and it's one that everyone living in the US must contend with. The proposed Yucca Mountain High-Level Nuclear Waste Repository site is in Nua and Nuuvi lands in the Great Basin, or a portion of what settlers named Nevada, about 100 miles from Nevada's most populous city, Las Vegas, also the former site of nuclear testing. Had the Yucca Mountain project gone forward, at least 70,000 metric tons of existing high-level nuclear waste from the nation's approximately 90 nuclear reactors and some of our weapons production would have been transported to the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository forever. The Western Shoshone National Council, the Duckwater Shoshone Council, and the Chemehueve Tribe of California, Southern Paiute, passed formal resolutions in opposition to the site. According to former Western Shoshone National Council leader Raymond Yowell, Yucca Mountain is a sacred site in our sovereign territory of Nua Segovia. Western Shoshone and Southern Paiute peoples and nations, along with Native allies from other nations, spoke out, protested, attended public hearings, filed court cases based on the Treaty of Ruby Valley to prevent the Yucca Mountain site from opening. Resistance began in about the 80s, held firm through the past 40-something years on the grounds that the facility would violate the Treaty of Ruby Valley and limit Indigenous relationships with Yucca Mountain, and then violate the spiritual and cultural beliefs about the more than human world and irrevocably harm lands and native lifeways. The Yucca Mountain proposal was stopped under the Obama administration and has not gone forward since. Private Fuel Storage was a private corporation made up of a consortium of energy companies facing a crisis with on-site storage of spent fuel. So every nuclear reactor has on-site nuclear waste that's currently being stored temporarily. And so they proposed a plan to the Skull Valley Goshute Nation. They said, we'd like to lease some land for a temporary high-level nuclear waste facility that would operate within the Skull Valley Goshute Reservation lands. PFS and Skull Valley moved forward with submitting a proposal to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They received a license in 2006. However, it was never built due to the contestation and political action that eventually resulted in PFS discontinuing its involvement in the site. So 2 nuclear waste sites proposed on native lands that were stopped, that were stopped in large part due to Indigenous activism. While the Skull Valley Goshute government supported the PFS site, a small cadre of Skull Valley Goshute peoples, primarily Margene Bull Creek and Sami Black Bear and their families, fought the decision of their nation's government based on claims that the Skull Valley Goshute government was misusing its authority and on spiritual mandates to protect their lands from nuclear waste, arguing that the site would damage our plant life, water, air, and spiritual atmosphere, as well as future generations. So for the Skull Valley Goshute people who opposed their site, their fight to protect sacred lands was mainly a fight against their own nation's government, but also included efforts to persuade the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Interior, to cancel the project. So my book amplifies the rhetorical tactics of nuclear decolonization that were used to prevent these 2 sites. I highlight 2 of the most significant rhetorical tactics: Indigenous lands rhetorics and Indigenous national interest rhetorics. So my first formal introduction to Nuasagobia was in May of 2004 when I attended the Western Shoshone National Council annual spring gathering at Crescent Valley. I went to learn more about Western Shoshone opposition to the Yucca Mountain nuclear waste site. I remember participating in the daily sunrise ceremonies led by the late Western Shoshone spiritual leader Corbin Harney, pictured on the screen. That's his book. With the sun just rising and in the chill of the desert morning, we stood bundled in jackets and sweatshirts, forming a circle around a fire, while Harney prayed to the Ba, which is water, Dabe, which is the sun, Dua Sungup, plant life, Bun Naram Nici, rocks, Neipe, wind, and more. Although I don't specifically remember which songs and prayers he sang, he likely sang a variant of this morning prayer that's published in his book. I pray this morning, sun, that as you come out, you will warm our bodies and cause all living things to grow on this earth. For without you, coming out every day, sun, nothing will survive. I pray that you will keep us healthy and keep us pure. Harney described the importance of morning circle in his book. When we form a circle for the morning ceremony, I ask people to stand up and down, standing up on Mother Earth. We make as perfect a circle as we can. The circle is important because ceremony ties in with the fire. Fire ties in with the land. I use some cedar and some herbs that I get off my own land in that part of the world. And when I gather them, I pray for them, I bless them, and I have to give something when I take it out of the ground. None of us can just go over there and grab something and take it out of the ground. We have to talk to it first. There's a song for everything. There's a song for the cedar. The fire has a song. The smoke has a song. You name it. Corbin is one of many traditionalists who work to keep the knowledges and epistemologies and ontologies and spiritualities about lands, including the animal life, plant life, water, air, and humans who relate to it, centered in the practices of Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Goshute peoples. Participating in these morning circles was the first time that I experienced in an embodied and placed way what I had read and thought and written about for years, which is Indigenous perspectives on and relationalities with land. Indigenous land protectors use these embodied and emplaced arguments about lands to ground their resistance to high-level nuclear waste sites and posit other futures Indigenous lands rhetorics are a theory and form of rhetorical practice that was invented by Indigenous peoples. It's grounded in, my research on it is grounded in analysis of archives, Indigenous stories as theory, participant observation, interviews, oral history interviews that I did with members of the nations. And I focus on homelands, sacred lands, and lands as relations as three intersecting rhetorical tactics that are grounded in Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Goshute knowledges and spiritualities. Of course, those are three nations. They are related. Goshute and Western Shoshone are Shoshone peoples, but living in different regions, but of course had different spiritualities and different connections to these places. Nuclear decolonization is fundamentally a struggle for both the return of Indigenous lands, that's the decolonization piece, and the ability to be in good relation with those lands, which is a resurgence piece. Indigenous lands rhetoric stand in direct contrast to settler imaginaries and descriptions of these proposed nuclear waste sites as wastelands and sacrifice zones in an already corrupted atomic West. So first, in terms of homelands, homelands are rooted in having lived in a place since time immemorial. For many Indigenous peoples, the homeland refers to a native territorial base, a place of ancestral, traditional, or contemporary occupation, use, and governments. At a public hearing in Las Vegas, Edward Smith, who was the chair at the time of the Southern Paiute Chemehueve Indian Nation, argues that multiple nations share Yucca Mountain as part of their homelands. He wrote, or stated, "Our people, along with other Southern Paiute tribes and Western Shoshone and Owens Valley Paiute peoples, have lived, traveled, worked, raised children, worshipped, harvested plants, animal, water, and mineral resources, and died in these lands for thousands and thousands of years. Our people were created on these lands. Our Creator gave us the sacred responsibility to live on, use, and care for the land and all of its resources so that future generations could benefit from the many gifts they provide to sustain life. These lands are part of our people, and we are part of these lands. The two connected as one, and that connection is everlasting. Even though we have been forced throughout history to give up and move away from many areas of our traditional homeland, this land is and will always be Indigenous lands. So appeals to homelands rhetorically shift from these non-Indigenous understandings of the regions as wasteland and land as property to calling forth the deep connections and relations since time immemorial. Then relatedly, so all three of these strategies are related. Sacred lands, homelands cannot easily be separated from the sacred. As Diné Hillier-Whittaker says, the religious significance of place is the spiritual glue that binds people to their homelands. Sacred lands are those relations that connect with the spiritual qualities of particular places, including all of those beings that reside within those places. For Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Goshute peoples and nations, their homelands are given by the Creator. They are inherently and inextricably also sacred lands. Wainuna Leduc tells us that more than 75% of Indigenous sacred sites have been removed from their care and jurisdiction. Native people must now request permission to use their own sacred sites. This happened at the Yucca Mountain facility. And the Nevada test site, and more often than not find that these sites are in danger of being desecrated or obliterated. As a result of various threats to sacred lands, Hillier-Whittaker adds, protecting sacred sites is one of the most difficult and pressing issues that Native people now face. Margene Bull Creek, in her defense of Skull Valley, pointed out that although it may seem like a lifeless wasteland to non-Indigenous people, it's actually very diverse. There's water, there's lots of plants and animals, but perceived by settlers as wasteland. There's great peace, spirituality, and vitality in the region. She stated in an oral history interview, "Our reservation is sacred. This is the only land we have, the only thing the government left us after taking most of our country." In a statement to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Ongo Guadadevia, which is an organization started by Margene to fight the site, argues, The organization is also very concerned about the loss of traditional sacred sites and the effect this facility might have on traditional plant gathering, and basically that the way of life of the Ghost Shoot Band will be forever changed should a nuclear accident occur. This statement emphasizes that protecting sacred lands is a matter of also preventing the loss of traditional ways of life. Sacred lands rhetorics enact indigenous ways of being and knowing that raise the value of lands through their qualities as opposed to the usability of land from a non-indigenous perspective. Relationality is also central to indigenous perspectives. Lands are homelands and sacred lands because of the relations, the kinships between indigenous people and the plants, animals in those places, the dirt, the rocks. These are deep relationships with humans, plants, ancestors, soil, water, air, all of these animate elements of a particular place. The kinship networks are rooted in reciprocity, responsibility, and respect. And of course, they take different forms across the diversity of indigenous peoples and nations globally and on this continent, but are still at the core of many indigenous ways of knowing. Western Shoshone elder Carrie Dan says, "To traditional indigenous people, the earth is alive. It is a mother to all life." Eunice Ote of the Mohapa Band of Paiute put it this way, "The land means everything to me. It feeds me. It clothes me. When I'm feeling bad, I can go there and I can talk to her because I know she's older than me and I know she controls me and I don't have any control of her, so I have a lot of respect for the land. It is my prayers. It's what keeps me alive all this time and my family." Eunice's comments remind me of how Robin Wall Kimmerer speaks of a world with a democracy of species. Relationality with those species is a key life way for indigenous peoples and nations, of course, the Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Ghost Shoot. In specific relation to nuclear waste, Edward Smith of the Chemehuevi Nation states, "We believe that Yucca Mountain will be unhappy and angry if you put radioactive waste into it. The spirits living in the area will move away, and eventually the land will be unable to sustain plants, animals, water, people, air, and life." Similarly, Marlene Begay, a member of the Walker River Paiute, says, "Putting nuclear waste in the land is polluting it and will kill Mother Earth. We have only one earth and one water. Everything is related. If we poison the earth, then we are poisoning ourselves." When Bull Creek states that the PFS facility would damage our plant life, water, air, and spiritual atmosphere as well as future generations, she demonstrates that this damage threatens those more than human beings and threatens the harmonious relationship built on respect. This form of indigenous lands rhetorics is an enactment of indigenous knowledges that seeks to sustain traditional relationships, but also continue those relationships contemporarily into the future, and including all of the beings that live in these places. So the book goes on. There's another larger chapter. I won't talk about it quite as much today, to look at what are called national interest rhetoric. So this is a second tactic that's used. The Yucca Mountain and Skull Valley PFS site controversies reflect inherent tensions between indigenous national interests and U.S. national interests. It's undoubtedly within the U.S. national interest to find a storage facility for high-level nuclear waste, as I mentioned before. They need to fulfill the obligations set out in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, fulfill obligations to respond to the legacies of nuclear weapons production. Yet, what about indigenous national interests? That question so rarely was asked in the deliberations. Here I focus on how Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Ghost Shoot peoples and nations express their own national interests in opposition to U.S. national interests. So indigenous national interest rhetorics are multiple and context dependent, but at their core, the rhetorics uphold, demand, and enact sovereignty, inherent sovereignty within a settler structure of political sovereignty that's designed to constrain indigenous self-determination. Indigenous rhetors, speakers, activists, tactically move between indigenous national interests and U.S. national interests between Indigenous citizenship, so being a citizen of Western Shoshone, for example, and being a US citizen, working both within and without of the structure of settler colonialism to use all available means of persuasion to advance Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. Across the differences between the Yucca Mountain and the Skull Valley PFS sites, Indigenous activists relentlessly asserted sovereignty and unique national interests by whatever means possible. Depending on the specific situation and context, Indigenous national interest rhetorics took the form of defending treaty rights, so the Treaty of Ruby Valley that protected Western Shoshone and Southern Paiute lands, enacting laws, demanding government-to-government relations. One of the biggest problems with the Yucca Mountain site was that the US federal government refused to engage in government-to-government relations, illuminating the distance between US interests and Indigenous national interests, sometimes aligning with US national interest, sometimes contesting the way that their own government was defining its national interest. So really complicated and multifaceted negotiations of national interest. While Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Goshute peoples and nations consistently defended their status as sovereign nations with their own national interests, there are also moments where they worked from their positionality as US citizens and their perceived status as members of the US public. So, for example, when calls for government-to-government relations were not recognized, as I mentioned earlier, Western Shoshone and Southern Paiute people and nations showed up in force at public hearings, refused to kind of answer the questions that were being posed about the scientific feasibility of the site, and instead demanded government-to-government interactions, demanded consideration of their national interests. When Skull Valley Goshute people opposed the decision of their own government, they appealed to the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as US citizens. So there's ways in which Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Goshute folks were brilliantly navigating their dual positionalities to be able to resist the site. So this is not covered in the book, but as I noted earlier, I've always seen the deep connections between art, activism, and nuclear decolonization movements. It's just been so amazing to see this art develop over time. My first exposure to nuclear colonization was actually through Leslie Marmon Silko's novel Ceremony. I know a different type of art, creative practice. And as is obviously no surprise to any of you in the audience, art is a key mode of resistance and survivance. It is also rhetorical and can be another tactic of nuclear decolonization movements. Actually, the first time I saw Will Wilson's photography was when it was on display at the Utah Museum of Fine Art as part of an art exhibit on air justice. And he had photos of abandoned uranium mines on Diné lands that make visible the invisible effects of radiation on these lands from uranium mining. Similarly, Western Shoshone artist Jack Malotte captures the embodied and placed experience of the Nua people who witnessed the mushroom clouds exploding on their lands. I really encourage you to see Collision during the coffee break if you haven't already. And what Corbin Harney, has called Western Shoshone and Southern Paiute lands the most bombed nation in the world due to 928 nuclear weapons detonated by the US government at the Nevada test site. And you'll hear more about testing in Aboriginal homelands later today. Zuni Pueblo artist Mallory Kaitaki's work embodies and emplaces the decades of uranium mining that happened on Indigenous lands in the Four Corners. And so these emphasize how both the cradle and the grave of the nuclear death cycle have killed people and their more than human kin within Indigenous lands, all in the name of US national security and national sacrifice. Yet, these examples also show survivance, brilliance, and resistance. They show nuclear decolonization. So an enduring memory from my engagement with nuclear colonization and decolonization happened very early in the research project. This project actually began as a graduate student, and here I am more than 20 years later, still engaged with it. But as a graduate student, I traveled to the Yucca Mountain Information Center in Las Vegas to access Department of Energy documents about the project. I went to this center every day, and I was combing through binder after binder of public comments. This was like pre-digitization, so I had to physically look through these public hearing transcripts. And one of the days, one of the employees at the center asked me about my project, and I told her that I was looking at Indigenous resistance to the Yucca Mountain site. And then she immediately responded that she had seen Native peoples give testimony, and she said it was just so quaint. And I remember very little about the rest of the conversation. Those two words, so quaint, have stuck with me all of these years, not only because they made me angry in the moment, and they still make me angry, but also because of how dismissive they were, channeling common stereotypes of Native peoples and nations as old-fashioned, stuck in the past, and these strangely exotic ecological Indians. In a way, my desire to change that woman's mind and to show her that Indigenous resistance to Yucca Mountain was not quaint, and to share with her the sophistication, the brilliance, and the power of Western Shoshone and Southern Paiute arguments against the site is one of the motivations that continued to drive my research project. Nuclear decolonization is, regardless of how settlers might perceive it, anything but quaint. It's a powerful mode of resistance. So nuclear decolonization is a movement created by and for Indigenous peoples and nations. It's an insistent and powerful mode of Indigenous survivance that enacts lands protection, sovereignty, and resurgence towards nuclear-free futures. These rhetorics are rooted in deep connections to specific places. And my retelling of how Western Shoshone, Southern Paiute, and Skull Valley Goshute people and nations fought to protect their lands simultaneously works to particularize and localize one mode of Indigenous social change, while also demonstrating that nuclear decolonization is one part of a larger story of Indigenous decolonization movements that have been on this continent since 1491 and continue to live in the present and will animate the future until Indigenous peoples and nations are free again. Although the book celebrates a moment of success within the nuclear decolonization movement, we can do this, we can be successful. It is persistent, malleable, and ongoing, as are all systems of oppression. One example illustrates, two examples illustrate the need for vigilance. The last remaining uranium mill within the US is on White Mesa Ute lands in southern Utah. Not only has this mill polluted for years, but with the newest invocation of the nuclear power renaissance, this mill will be ramping up and is now taking uranium that is being mined from Hopi and Diné lands near the Grand Canyon, uranium mines that have just recently opened. I won't go into a lot of detail about this second one, but you may have heard President Trump is considering resuming nuclear testing in the US. So nuclear decolonization is a distinct form of indigenized environmental justice movement that cannot be subsumed within mainstream anti-nuclear or environmental movements. So environmental justice frameworks that cannot attend to Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous land rights will not be able to account for the needs of Indigenous communities. And so in closing, I would just ask you to share these stories. Think about how your own work intersects with Indigenous sovereignty and survivance, and amplify Indigenous environmental justice efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle, so much. I learned so much from your talk, and I really look forward to the Q&A at the end of our program. The next person we'll welcome to the stage is Will Wilson. Will is a Diné photographer, a trans-customary artist who spent his formative years living on the Navajo Nation. He's now Associate Professor of Studio Art at the University of Texas at Austin. He's held visiting professorships at the Institute of American Indian Arts, Oberlin College, and the University of Arizona. Will's art projects center around the continuation and the transformation of customary Indigenous cultural practice. In 2007, because of that amazing work, he's been rewarded with these amazing placements. He won the Native American Fine Art Fellowship from the Auditorium Museum in 2010, the Joan Mitchell Foundation Award for Sculpture, and then in 2006, the Pollock Krasner Foundation grant for photography. And now in 2020, Will was the Duran Artist in Residence at Yale University Art Gallery. In 2017, Will received the New Mexico Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts, and it's no wonder. His work has been exhibited and collected internationally, and we're so grateful to have him here. Greg reminded me last night that when initial lists for a program like this were being brainstormed years ago, Will was the first person whose name came to mind, and we're so grateful to finally bring you to the University of Virginia. So Will, I'll welcome you to the stage.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We can turn the lights down so that the images look better. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's so exciting to be here and to be hosted by UVA and then also the Kluge-Ruhe, and to be in a space with Nici Cumpston again, who I got to meet in Adelaide in Southern Australia. I think it was in 2015, I'm not sure. But you've done an amazing thing by bringing her on as director, I think. So good for you. Okay, I'm Will. I'm Kia'ani. On my mother's side, I'm also Irish and Welsh on my father's side. I did grow up in Twinanistisi. There's a fellow Tubicidian in the audience. This is actually an image of my family going to Tuba Trading Post from their summer sheep camp, right? And so the little girl in the foreground is my mother, Lola Itsidi, and I imagine this was when she was about 10 years old. And you know, I'm a photographer. I'm sort of interested in time and lens-based sort of kind of recordings of history and memory. And how those get manipulated and transformed and tell stories for various reasons. But it's also this sort of time traveling thing, right? And when I look at this image, it amazes me, and it's wonderful to see my family again. But just how much has changed in such a short amount of time, right? So this is the advanced clicker. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my practice. I may read a little bit from something that I've written about this, but essentially I'm going to talk about two bodies of work. One is called Autoimmune Response, which is sort of me imagining sort of a creative approach to engaging with some of these ideas that we've talked about. And then also a project called Connecting the Dots for a Just Transition that's an outgrowth. An outgrowth of that project. So I fell in love with photography early on in high school, and I was, sort of drawn to documentary photography and the telling of stories through image. And I focused on my friends and family on the Navajo Nation. I grew up in Tuba City, like I said. I went to Tuba City boarding school for 5 years, the Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school that my mom actually, shortly after that picture was made, was taken to, right? So she hadn't gone to school yet at that point, and she was, forcibly removed from her family and taken to boarding school. So, like, years later, I actually went to the same school. And that became sort of like the source. Later, I went to Oberlin College in Ohio, and I started thinking a little more critically about photography and just, this media, the documentary process, how Indigenous folks have been sort of historically represented through photography, and then trying to figure out my role in that process, right? And not wanting to be sort of reproducing a sort of extractive, like, storytelling form. So it was 1992, actually, when I put this together, and 1992 was sort of this pivotal moment in contemporary Indigenous art, at least here, because it was the quincentenary and of Columbus's, so-called discovery of the Americas. And there was a ton of programming going on. And so we invited Edgar Heap of Birds, who's a Northern Cheyenne artist, to do a colloquium. And so I got to work with him there, and he sort of encouraged me to think about environment, installation, architecture as maybe a form to mediate the reception of my work, right? So this is sort of what I ended up doing sort of for my undergrad thesis project. And, this is, of course, all pre-digital. And then a little bit forward, this is my MFA show at the University of New Mexico. I was drawn to UNM just because it was closer to home, but also because there was, a particular interest in the history of photography there. And now they have an amazing sort of Native studies program. And, so many amazing scholars have come through that space, largely because of Jennifer Diné, who's a scholar there, right? The first, I guess, Diné PhD in history, interestingly enough. So I built these environments in order to sort of steward the people in the images in some ways, right? This is a bit of a fast forward. This is a body of work called Autoimmune Response. And I'm still doing this project. I tend to do these long form projects. And it's essentially following the travails of a protagonist who I perform that role. A Diné man trying to navigate a space that's become toxic to him and wondering why this world has become toxic to him. And you can see sort of subtly, I was able to include one of the nuclear test images from the Nevada test site, right? And so it becomes like this harbinger of things to come. And so, it also gave me an opportunity to sort of go back home and spend a lot of time on the land and photograph myself in these spaces and think about sort of how one would survive in this situation. Autoimmune response is meant to sort of invoke autoimmune disease and to think about disease that is caused by sudden changes in economies, environments, foodways, and Indigenous folks are often sort of the sentinel kind of populations in relation to that, right? And so the protagonist finds himself a home to live in, right? And so this is a customary Diné architectural form, the hogan. This is actually at our winter sheep camp. My grandfather built this space. And it became, in this narrative, sort of a laboratory of sorts for him to sort of be sustained in and move forward, do research, come back, figure out what's going on. There's also reference to the Navajo creation story in this series of work. There were these sort of archetypical twin figures, born of water and monster slayer, who make this sort of iteration of the world habitable for us, right, for humanity. But I was also thinking about sort of the history of extraction, and particularly of uranium on the Navajo Nation and its processing. And so by the end of this first cycle of images, the protagonist sort of fashions a home of his own making, right? I've also wanted to build a hogan, so I got to make one and sort of incorporate it into the series. And this is the first iteration of the Autoimmune Response Project. This was at the Heard Museum. There's a great curator, Joe Baker, a Delaware man, who had actually previously been dean at the Institute of American Indian Art, where I taught for a while. But when Joe got the job as the sort of curator at the Heard, he invited me to do my first sort of one-person show. And so that became sort of the impetus to put all of this together. So this is a little bit of sort of background. the kind of research that went into the production of that initial series. Weaving was an important sort of thing that I was trying to think about in relation to the characters' sort of sustenance. And then in terms of sustenance, like the next phase of the project was imagining like how do you move forward, right? How do you survive in this time and space? And food, of course, is important. At the time, I was teaching at the University of Arizona, and there's an amazing organization called Native Seed Search there. That's like a seed bank for heirloom variety seed from the Southwest in northern Mexico. And so I cultivated their seed in the Hogan, and that led to sort of a next phase, a next life. I call this the air laboratory. And so it's had a few different lives. This was at the Denver Botanical Garden. And we actually did an imagined sort of like a larger scale production, right? Because they have these amazing greenhouses at the Denver Botanical Garden. And we were able to cultivate like a lot of the food. We did like, you know, the Three Sisters in this sort of iteration of the air lab. A little later, you know, I sort of spoke about an interest in the history of photography and also of process, I think. And so this is a blend of digital and wet plate collodion, which is sort of, you know, the third photographic process invented. And it was the process of the era of sort of American expansion into what is now, you know, the Southwest, right? So after the Treaty of Guadalupe in 1848, you know, there was this newly acquired territory that was surveyed, and photography played a big sort of component in that process of surveying. And so I'm trying to infer sort of those histories, like through, you know, the photographic technology as the story moves forward. So this is back at that confluence, and now I'm sort of bringing in other people. My mother shows up again, and that's my daughter, Zoe. So that process, like working through that, sort of led me to thinking more about sort of the history of uranium extraction and processing on the Navajo Nation, and it brought me to Church Rock, which the United Nuclear Church Rock mill spill is, you know, by the numbers, America's worst nuclear accident that, you know, not like a great many people in the American public know about. There was a retention dam that held a lot of water, like low-level radioactive acidic water, as well as some pretty high-level tailings. But that burst, and I think 93 million gallons of material flowed into the Rio Puerco, which is one of the tributaries that flows into the Little Colorado River, which flows back through the Navajo Nation. And there's a community here, the Redwater Pond community, that's been sort of, you know, they've been activating around that issue for the last 46 years now, trying to get some level of redress in relation to this. So this was just the last version of sort of the commemoration of the event. So I'm trying to theorize or think about like how I move from this more sort of fictive, like critical imagination, sort of more internal project to something that's, again, more documentary. This is Larry King. He's one of the key organizers from the Redwater community. And he puts on, you know, in coalition with a bunch of other organizations, this commemoration each year. That's like the part of the remediated site of one of the mines that is directly behind the community. This is, you know, sort of abandoned warehouse of the United Nuclear Corporation, which is still very much interested in sort of getting back in there and sort of doing what is it called, in situ leaching, right? Which is sort of like nuclear fracking, essentially, right? I mean, there has been a moratorium on the Navajo Nation since 2005, but this region is the checkerboard region, so some areas are actually not sort of tribally held, they're held sort of in private leases, and so through that mechanism, it's possible to get, these corporations to get inroads into accessing the nuclear material again. This is actually one of the evaporation ponds at the site of the dam that burst at Church Rock. And this is more from this, I guess, documentary project that I'm doing called Connecting the Dots for a Just Transition, which is really about sort of a counter survey of the over 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation. So since 2019, I've been sort of mapping, in some ways, these different sites. This is, again, Church Rock and the Redwater community. This is just outside of Tuba City. It's the rare metals uranium processing mill. This isn't my photograph. This is Joel Sternfeld's photograph from his American Prospect series. But he came through town, apparently, and photographed this. And I remember this site because I used to go visit it as a kid. And now it's sort of adjacent to a Superfund site. It's not under the same legislation. It's an UMTRAC site, right? A government program to deal with former mill sites and deal with like the tailings piles that exist there. But it's 4 miles outside of Tuba. It's also, just upgrade from a really important water source, the Moenkopi Wash, which runs through Moenkopi, which is a Hopi community sort of adjacent to Tuba City, which is just on the horizon there. But, they are worried about sort of water contamination and like the vectors of leaching that are happening underneath this site. And that's where it is in relation to Tuba. This is the map that sort of engendered the Connecting the Dots for a Just Transition name. I'm focusing on the western region because that's where I know the best, where I grew up. But the goal of the project is to document as many of these things as possible. So this is just off-res, but adjacent to the Little Colorado River. This is an upgrading facility, which is sort of like a pre-processing facility where they would do an initial sort of culling of the ore. But it's like a particularly hot site. This is near Cameron, Arizona, and this has been somewhat remediated. I'm also interested in just like thinking about this photographic technology, the drone, which is, like a former military technology. Well, it's still very much a military technology, I guess. But like to use it in the service of imaging sort of environmental injustice, right? It's like opened up an amazing sort of ability to image this stuff in a new way, given, you can't afford, it's expensive to hire a plane to take these pictures, right? But it's very easy to just sort of drive around, find these sites, and then just send a drone up a few hundred feet, and it totally transforms the way you understand the land and landscape. That's Monument Valley on the horizon, sort of the iconic Western landscape. The same year that John Ford was shooting The Searchers, they were beginning the construction of the processing mill here, the rare metals processing mill. So when I was out there photographing it, I was like, what is that? There's something out in the middle of this sort of 50-acre field of river rock. And it's funny that they monumentalize this, or they put like a memorial plaque in sort of the center of this space. I wonder if I can, oh, how? Is there a way to run the video? Oh, there we go. So this is just a video because the drones can shoot video, which is which is pretty miraculous too. And it just gives you sort of a better sense of the scale of the site. And this is sped up, so it won't take very long. How deep is it? I don't know. You can go on the EPA website and see the elevations, like the schematics. It's like, you know, the ore is there and all of the, I mean, they aggregated material from mines all in this region because Monument Valley was a particularly sort of rich area for uranium mining. So they consolidated it at the site of the processing mill. I mean, it's maybe like 3 feet, and there's a clay body, there's something else, and then there's this river rock. And there's the plaque. And so all of these untracked, like major remediated sites, disposal sites have one of these, I've discovered, in the very center, right? Sort of inviting an invitation to irradiate yourself, to go check out what's out there. But, you know, drones have made this project possible, really, in a lot of ways. Because you could very much, you know, very easily drive past these sites and not even know they're there. You know, of course, like when they were mining this stuff, they didn't tell the workers about how dangerous the material was. There was no sort of implementation of protective, like personal protective equipment. This is the Energy Fuels Incorporated. It's like sort of America's last traditional processing mill. The Grand Canyon Trust has done a pretty interesting expose about how they're essentially doing like an end run around a lot of nuclear sort of regulation, and it's, you know, they have I guess a legacy reprocessing license, and it's essentially a nuclear dump, and this also is 2 miles upgrade from the Ute Mountain community, right? So they are very much concerned about groundwater contamination, and, you know, just the wind, I guess. But again, you know, it would be really hard to photograph this from the ground, but you show up on Sunday morning right before football starts, and you send up the drone, and, you know, no one bothers you. And they sort of like intentionally built up berms all around it. So if you did go to try and photograph it, you know, unless you had some way to elevate yourself, it's sort of impossible to photograph. So I've been doing this project in collaboration with Diné College, which is the tribal college on the Navajo Nation. And this is our website, which we're currently sort of rebuilding. But part of it is this speaker series that hopefully we just got funding to sort of kick it up again. So we'll be inviting other people who are working on this issue. But these are all hour-long kind of talks, and then like kind of a Q&A with, primarily the main audience was students at the college, right? But it's really meant to be sort of expand out from that center. Chip Thomas, he talks about public health in relation to this issue. He was an Indian Health Service physician for like 30 years. He's also an amazing photographer and has done all of this sort of public art intervention with his photography in collaboration with poets. Leona Morgan has been a nuclear activist for like almost 30 years now. She's working on doing her graduate studies now at UNM, but she's, just been an amazing sort of voice against this for a long time. Dylan McLaughlin is an artist and a friend. He's Diné, who sort of engages these ideas. Tanya Willard was one of the curators from the exposure exhibition that we mounted at the Museum of Contemporary Native Art. And Valerie Rangel has written a primer sort of on environmental justice in New Mexico, and so she sort of set the groundwork for this. But we're hoping to get some folks like Shayla Blatchford, the Anti-Uranium Mapping Project, if you guys have heard about that. Melanie Yazzie, who's an amazing activist and academic. Oops, I went backwards. But so it also has a database that sort of cites all of the mines, and it's going to be the sort of foundation for the app that we're developing, right? So we were supposed to, we tested it this summer, didn't work great, so we're sort of re-engaging it. But these are the names of the mines, and often the mines were created sort of in collaboration with a grazing permit holder. And this is in the 50s and 60s. So the name of the mine isn't very useful. But if you know what chapter you're in, that's essentially like a county on the Navajo Nation, then you can find the site. So the database is going to have all of this information as well. There has been a fair amount of sort of assessment done to a lot of these sites with the Navajo Nation EPA and the broader federal EPA. Where they've sent a person with a GPS backpack and a Geiger counter, and there's these gamma paths that are, well, I'll show you one right now. This is sort of drilling down through the EPA's website to find these site screening reports. So the site screening reports are sort of the basis for the database as well as the application that we're going to build, or that we're in the process of building. And that's what this is about. So this is our sort of proposal to talk about, this sort of location-based app. It'll show you where you are on your phone in relation to the mines nearest you, and give you at least a baseline information, a bit of information based on those site screening reports. Eventually, we're hoping to sort of expand that, collect stories, include photography, potentially have a weather sort of function in it so when the winds are coming. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about people who've supported this. So the Native Arts and Culture Foundation and their SHIFT grant, it's amazing. If you're an Indigenous artist who's interested in sort of, work around different ideas around indigeneity and justice, it's a wonderful opportunity. Also, the Indian Collective and their Radical Imagination grant supported the project. And then this is just, back to the protagonist. He's got a fancy drone now, and he's back out on the landscape trying to figure out how to integrate these two kind of not dissimilar projects. It's interesting, I drove through recently Skull Valley, Goshen Territory, when I was doing this, sort of comparative analysis between these nuclear disposal cells and the sort of history of land art in the United States, But there's another iteration of the thing. And then this is the last time that I showed the Air Lab was at the Utah Museum of Fine Art. And I imagined it as sort of a research site for the protagonist or anybody who wanted to come and join it. And in this iteration, we grew phytoremediator species that can actually eat heavy metals. Like at Chernobyl, they planted all of these sunflowers to sort of draw some of the heavy metals out of the soil. But, oh, it's not me. That's our schedule. I think I'm right on time. Yeah, so that's pretty much my discussion. I really look forward to the conversation later. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, and that was perfect to have the schedule up on the screen. Will, thank you so much. It was hard to not let your jaw just involuntarily drop at every image you presented. We really appreciate you coming to share your work with us. Coffee break. There's coffee, should be, yep, in the back there on the right. We'll break for half an hour, speak with our artists, and if you haven't had a chance to see Collisions, now would be a good time to run next door to the Scholars Lab in Shannon Library. It's about 18 minutes, so you should be able to fit something in, and there's 2 headsets. So please come back here, and we'll get started again at 2:30. Thank you. Thank you all again for coming to this program, and I'm really excited for this afternoon of speakers, and I think the most excited for the panel discussion at the end of this, which will bring us all together to finally get a chance to ask some questions. The next person we're going to welcome is Greg Castillo. Greg Castillo is professor of architecture at the University of California, Berkeley, and a research associate at the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney in Australia. He specializes in the architectural history of interwar and post-war America and Europe. While at the University of Sydney in 2006, Greg began collecting paintings by artists of the Spinifex Arts Project, and their paintings are what are on view in our exhibition now at Kluge-Ruhe. He was riveted by the story of how Spinifex artists had painted their way out of nuclear colonial dispossession. Over the next 18 years, Castillo carefully collected multiple works by individual artists to demonstrate the trajectory of their artistic practices. He and Gary Brown began donating paintings from their collection to Kluge-Ruhe in 2021. And this transformative gift of over 35 paintings, produced between 2001 and 2021, includes many of the leading artists from this community. And it was this exhibition that inspired us to do this program today. So, Greg, we thank you for that and for the gift of the paintings, and welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you for being here. It's such an honor to share this podium with such distinguished speakers. So what you're seeing on the screen is not a painting, actually, but it's a vignette of the marks and spatters on the floor of the Spinifex painting shed at Chunchunchara in Australia's Great Victoria Desert. In my talk, I'll frame the paintings created in this space and now on display at the Kluge-Ruhe Museum as artifacts of nuclear colonialism, or actually more accurately put, artifacts of nuclear decolonization. Scholars, of course, use this term, nuclear colonialism, to describe the disproportionate impact of making and testing atomic weapons on the lands and bodies of Indigenous people. To regard Indigenous people, though, as passive subjects would revive a destructive colonialist trope. First Nations people have assumed a vanguard position in acknowledging and disrupting the ideologies and policies fostering nuclear violence. In this talk, I hope to demonstrate the global breadth of Indigenous resistance to nuclear colonialism through art and storytelling. I'll then zoom in on the Spinifex Arts Project and its activist intervention into injustices caused by nuclear weapons testing in Australia. And this is knowledge that I hope will deepen your appreciation of the heroic body of art created by a community of First Nations masters. Our symposium was catapulted into relevance just a week ago when social media posts by President Donald Trump announced that the U.S. would resume nuclear weapons testing after a 33-year moratorium. In response to Trump's threat, 2 days ago, Vladimir Putin began preparing for Russia's first nuclear test since 1991. In fact, no nation has tested a nuclear weapon since 2017, when North Korea detonated a 250-kiloton underground device, producing a 6.3 magnitude earthquake that demolished buildings and killed dozens of North Korean civilians. It is precisely this kind of planetary violence that Indigenous artists and activists are rejecting. The desecration of Indigenous lands through U.S. nuclear weapons testing and uranium mining has generated a compelling body of resistance art. On the left, Radiation Map by Samoan artist Dan Tualalapa McMullen injects terror into the graphic symbol for radiation hazard. His anti-nuclear works respond to both the U.S. use of the Pacific Islands as an atomic bomb test site, but also the family trauma of having a father who worked on Nevada bomb test sites while in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and who was told that exposure to radiation meant that he should never have children. Poise End, shown on the right, is an immersive VR video by Diné artist Clay Benali. It takes viewers to Navajo lands contaminated by uranium mining to hear the stories of its human impact. He writes of the work, "We are not victims but survivors who continue to resist and fight for Mother Earth and our future generations." The degree of contamination from more than 400 nuclear detonations conducted between 1949 and 1989 at the Semipalatinsk test range in Kazakhstan, a former Soviet republic, remained a state secret through the 20th century to avoid compensation claims by victims. Kazakh artist Karipbek Kuyukov, whose works First Explosion and Mother's Mission you see at the top of the screen, paints by holding a brush with his teeth. In a village 60 miles from the Semipalatinsk test site, Kuyukov was born without arms due to his parents' exposure to radioactive particles. Kuyukov today is one of Kazakhstan's most recognized contemporary artists and was a key participant in the anti-nuclear campaign that made Kazakhstan the world's first nation to ban atomic weapons. Upon receiving the 2018 Nuclear Free Future Award for Education, he said, "I have no arms, but I join you in waving goodbye to nuclear weapons." Born in the Marshall Islands, Kathy Jetnil Kijiner writes poetry that explores the transformation of everyday customs and traditions as islanders cope with the literal and figurative fallout of U.S. military occupation. Dear Matafele Painam, a poem promising her 7-month-old daughter the bequest of a habitable world, received a standing ovation when she performed it at the 2014 United Nations Climate Summit. Awarded a fellowship at the MIT Media Lab, Jetnil Kitchener fused poetry with new media in her 2018 video Anointed, with its hauntingly beautiful images of Runit Dome, a concrete nuclear coffin built to contain plutonium waste on a test site in the U.S. Marshall Islands. And you can find this on Vimeo. Very, very beautiful work of art. Another anti-nuclear work of sublime beauty is Thunder Raining Poison by Australian Kolkata and Unuku artist Ioani Scarce, here seen stunningly displayed at this year's Tarnandi Festival of Aboriginal and Torres Straits Islander Art in Adelaide. The installation features a hovering cloud of 2,000 glass bulbs blown in the shape of yams, a bush food staple. The yams, which of course grow underground, here take on the materiality of atomic glass. This is a kind of a glass that's produced when thermonuclear test heat fuses sand at desert bomb sites. Scarce's suspended cloudburst shimmers with the promise of a long-awaited desert rain, but conveys sinister overtones of the fallout clouds that swept across Australia in the 1950s. This stunning gallery hang was created by Kluge-Ruhe director Nici Cumpston, who underscores the theme of nuclear colonialism in a sense with 2 large Spinifex artworks seen here on the right. The men's collaborative canvas titled Ilkurka and the women's collaborative Kuruala, both of 2015. These collaborative works do not comment explicitly on nuclear colonialism, but are in many ways its product. Native title, the Australian legal process of claiming Indigenous land rights, generated Spinifex collaborative paintings as an aesthetic practice. Spinifex people used paintings to document their continuous connection to homelands in their successful native title claim. By securing traditional ownership of a 55,000-kilometer expanse in Western Australia, Spinifex people brought to an end decades of forced exile from the lands adjacent to Australia's nuclear weapons testing zone. A vortex of historical events unleashed far from the Western desert upended its First Nation lives and generated contemporary Spinifex painting as a mitigation tactic. This case study in the Cold War's long reach into unexpected places and with unexpected results was my entry point into Spinifex art as a sort of accidental archivist. I moved to Australia in 2007 to take a position in architectural history at the University of Sydney. My research concerned an odd Cold War development, the American use of suburban homes and furnishings as cultural propaganda. The U.S., as it turns out, shipped model homes across the Atlantic during the 1950s to convince post-war Europeans of the superiority of consumer capitalism. As strange as it may seem, suburban ranch homes, electric refrigerators, and department store furniture all were recruited as weapons in America's Cold War arsenal, a story that I tell in this book, Cold War on the Home Front. While navigating my new Australian foothold with a head immersed in geopolitical curiosities, I crossed paths with another cultural manifestation of Cold War conflict, one that was breathtaking in its aesthetic richness and narrative power. My daily walk to the university took me past 4 leading Aboriginal art galleries during a period of frothy expansion in the market for desert art. It was all but impossible not to understand that amazing developments were afoot in Australian Indigenous contemporary art. I was fortunate to have Rosalind Premont at Gallery Gondwana and Gabriella Roy at Aboriginal and Pacific Art Gallery as enthusiastic mentors as I looked and I learned. The work of Spinifex Art Project soon captured my full attention. Only one local dealer represented the group, Kui Gallery. And upon my inquiry, a gallerist's plunge into the stockroom uncovered a work that had languished uncatalogued for 6 years. And I recognized the work immediately as one that had been published in this photo that you see on the left of one of the painting camps that recharged the bond between Spinifex artists and their sacred homelands. The work by Kunmanara Jerome Anderson exuded, at least for me, an absolutely irresistible magnetism. I went home with heart lifted and checking account gutted. The way I acquired and collected Spinifex works grew actually out of my academic research practices. While I treasure these works as aesthetic objects, I also see them as historical artifacts that, when aggregated, become amplified in meaning. Placed in dialogue with each other, Spinifex canvases document the survival of cultural memory despite its attempted erasure, and an ethos of impassioned land custodianship, Indigenous knowledge that is generously shared with us and that we ignore at our own peril. While creating the archive of Spinifex paintings displayed at the Kluge-Ruhe, I also researched their nuclear colonial context. Of course, the sacred stories told by Spinifex artworks can only be disclosed by the artists, but instead, in tracing the artist's entanglement with nuclear weapons testing, I attempt to reveal our own cult secrets, rather than the culturally restricted worlds encoded within Spinifex artworks. Australia and the UK began nuclear weapons testing at the Maralinga site in South Australia in 1952. Nomadic land routes that had been used for millennia traversed the so-called prohibited area. To clear the land of nomads, government patrol officers and missionaries collected Spinifex people for relocation at sites hundreds of kilometers from their homelands, while circulating concocted myths about evil spirits that had poisoned the land and its waters. Warned about supernatural toxins by officials and their indigenous liaisons, Spinifex people left their homelands for mission life in ever greater numbers. Those who remained were increasingly isolated, having lost the youths needed to parent new generations, but also the elders whose knowledge provided guidance and protection. One Spinifex family evaded detection until 1986. Inducted into a mission community, they were the last in more than 1,000 generations to abandon their nomadic lifeways for settlement life. Australian press coverage proclaimed the discovery of, quote, the last desert tribe with primitivist tropes. They were said to have, quote, never seen the modern world before. However, newspaper art readers remained ignorant of an aspect of modernity to which Spinifex elders had quite literally been exposed. In response to the thundering shudder of an atomic bomb blast, Glenn Richter, as he was renamed by missionaries, had covered himself with sand for protection. Today, the Richter sons, Ian, Mick, and Noli, are celebrated Spinifex artists. You see Noli Richter on the right with his award-winning canvas that just got last year Australia's top honors for Aboriginal art. Roy Underwood, Simon Hogan, Carleen West, Myrtle Pennington, all of them Spinifex men and women who became major painters, also witnessed nuclear tests. Cast as human subjects in an uncontrolled experiment and displaced from their homelands by the threat of radioactive contaminants, Old Man Richter and his Spinifex kin were both custodians of an ancient culture and simultaneously Cold War moderns. The Woomera test range in Central Australia is right below the painting that I have shown there of a dot painting of an atomic bomb blast, and the site called Maralinga is where bombs were set off. When military authorities arrived in Australia to conduct their first test blast, their only information source on the Aboriginal population was from an Encyclopedia Britannica entry. Responsibility for ensuring the safety of natives, both Indigenous and otherwise, fell to Australian officials. Just 2 men were assigned to the task of patrolling the 100,000 square kilometer Woomera range. Sweeps made in 1956, the year that saw the first of 7 detonations at Maralinga, and in 1959, revealed dozens of Indigenous nomads who were making hunting trips that crossed into the western edge of the weapons testing area. When collected for transfer to remote missionary settlements, many recounted their terror upon hearing and seeing nuclear detonations. Fortunately, Australia's predominantly westerly winds protected the Spinifex homelands that were located windward from the Maralinga test site. Maps of the distribution of the fallout from bomb tests, which you see on the top right, which were kept secret until the 1984 Royal Commission into British nuclear tests in Australia, revealed that Brisbane, 2,700 kilometers from Maralinga, received a far greater dose of radioactive contaminants than Spinifex country, just 25 kilometers to the east, rather to the west, sorry. During the course of the 1970s, thousands of Aboriginal people, encouraged by new government policies of self-determination, abandoned relocation settlements to return back to country in an epoch-defining outstation movement. With a compensation award by the Royal Commission, Spinifex people made their way back home. Elder Simon Hogan, called a quote-unquote walking encyclopedia of tradition, trekked 300 kilometers from the Kundalini mission to Chunchanchara, as his son followed behind him driving a road grader. Located in a southeastern portion of the Spinifex homelands, Chunchanchara would become the most remote outstation settlement in Australia. The new residence arrived in an Army surplus truck that you see in both of these images. It still exists in skeletal form on the right at Chunchunchara, a kind of ruinous hulk that delivered Spinifex people from their long exile. In 1992, a landmark decision by the Australian High Court overturned the legal doctrine of terra nullius, the colonial fiction that Australian land was a blank canvas without owners. Within a year, Spinifex people launched a native title claim. Community members born in Spinifex country began painting as legal documentation of their land tenure. With an assistance from local community arts coordinator Louise Allerton, elders created the map of birthplaces that you see on the left as preparation for collaborative paintings that would serve as evidence of traditional land ownership. Birthplaces mark custodianship of specific places associated with the ancestral origin stories called chukurpa, sometimes called dreamings, that trace paths or song lines across the Spinifex homelands, as you see on the right. Both the process and its proposed product, painterly representations crafted explicitly for public disclosure of birthrights associated with sacred places, some ascribed with extreme ontological peril, had no historical precedent for either Spinifex artists or their culture. The first two collective paintings were unveiled at the signing of a native title agreement in July 1998 at Miramirachara, a remote oasis on a site so charged with metaphysical dangers that elders entered in advance to introduce the place to its new visitors. When he arrived by helicopter, the Premier of Western Australia, Richard Court, was only the third white Australian to ever see the sacred water source. Court called this first native title determination on the Australian mainland the most significant act of his premiership. These paired paintings, presented as a gift to the state of Western Australia, mark the genesis of Spinifex painting practices that have endured to this day. A market for Spinifex works emerged when a traveling exhibition featuring the native title paintings toured half a dozen Australian cities in 1999. At a moment of expanding Aboriginal art sales, the debut of a new cohort of painters excited gallery owners, and Spinifex artists eagerly embraced the public affirmation of their traditional ownership of country, as well as the novel concept of being remunerated for documenting their custodial authority. In addition to paintings depicting the birthright lands and stories of individual artists, the practices of collective painting that began with the twin native title canvases have also continued. The set of guidelines for Spinifex painting practices that emerged from the native title artworks has been described by curators as follows. Unless married, men and women usually work separately. Each gender owns and paints its own ancestral narratives. Within that gender division, collaboration is encouraged. Indeed, it is an essential element of painting practice. Paired men's and women's collaboratives are the calling card of Spinifex exhibitions, like the British Museum's 2015 blockbuster Indigenous Australia. You're seeing the women's collective painting being in process here. At the Kluge-Ruhe Spinifex show, we are very fortunate to be able to display a collaborative canvas generously loaned by the Fondation Opal in Switzerland. You might notice that in this slide caption, most of the artists are referred to as kunmunara. This is a term used for recently deceased person as a part of a mourning ritual. The passing of so many senior artists over the past decade has made the cultivation of a new generation of painters a priority for the Spinifex Arts Project. On a visit to the Spinifex painting shed today, in addition to the major artists like Timo and Nali Richter or Leonard Walker and Simon Hogan, you'll see the newest generation of artists at work. Here's Michelle Anderson, who counts the major artists Myrtle Pennington and Carleen West as her grandmothers. Michelle watched and listened for years as her grandmother Myrtle painted the significant sites of Mulpaya and Kanpa. The subtle generational transfer of Chukurpa knowledge continued as Michelle began to help her increasingly frail grandmother with her own artworks. And with her grandmother's passing, Michelle has emerged as a singular talent, grounding her creative development in a rich inherited legacy of cultural custodianship. So as you visit the gallery in your own personal encounter with the artworks displayed, please keep in mind a proviso about the Spinifex history you've heard today. Although Spinifex painting practices may have been sparked by the turbulent realities of nuclear colonialism, that history cannot contain its cultural outcomes. The vital bond with country and its spiritual forces transcend Cold War politics and hostile technologies, because that bond with country is nothing less than the lived truth of Spinifex people. It is that lived truth and its custodianship of a sacred life world that is shared with us through the generosity of Spinifex artists and which we are duty-bound to learn from. Thank you very much.
Greg, thank you. Thank you for that. And please come see these amazing paintings in person at the museum. Next, we're going to introduce our last speaker, Nici Cumpston. Nici introduced herself earlier, but I'm going to repeat some of that. Nici Cumpston is a proud Barkandji artist, a curator, a writer, an educator whose family are also of Afghan, Irish, and English descent. Nici has served as the inaugural curator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art at the Art Gallery of South Australia, which she began in 2008, and she also served as the artistic director of the internationally renowned Tarnanthi Festival of Contemporary Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art, beginning in 2014. Tarnanthi is an amazing event that was held annually and features artists from all over Australia in dozens of exhibitions and events, all over Adelaide. Through this work, Nici has worked with actually like hundreds and hundreds, I think it's like 900 artists over the years, and since 2008 has curated 16 major exhibitions, including national and international touring shows, each with an accompanying catalog. It's an incredible resume. And because of that, and in acknowledgement of her deep expertise, in 2020, she received the Order of Australia Medal for Outstanding Achievement to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Arts. We're so lucky that Nici then decided to join us in May as the director of Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection. So thank you for coming, Nici, and thank you for sharing your knowledge. Welcome you to the stage.
Thank you. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the artists whose work I've been, given the pleasure of being able to work with over many years, that talk to and are, sharing with us their own personal stories, either their own living memory or whether they're family members' memories of their connection to different places that have been affected through the atomic bomb testing and the rocket testing that's happened in Australia. So I'll just start. I wanted to share this quote with you from our most recent artist in residence, Robert Fielding, because for me, I feel like this helps to kind of ground where we come from. And I say we as in myself as an Aboriginal person who is also an artist. And, I wholeheartedly agree with Robert's sentiment in that, that this is our collective voice, that together we are sharing aspects of our culture, and through the works of art that we make, we are making, statements about what's important to us, but what also is important to all of us as human beings. So, and it is a way, that we can all be united through the power of art. So I won't read it. Is everyone okay to read it? Or do you need me to read it out? No? Okay, great. Yeah. And if anybody hasn't seen it yet, Robert's exhibition is still on at the Kluge-Ruhe, so please come and see it. Robert Fielding, Jugurpa, handle it. Yeah, it's a great exhibition. I've also included a map, and I'll just kind of point out where it's the same map, as in it's showing the same locations that Greg did as well. And you can see here, like Maralinga Village, Oak Valley, and here we have Junjunjara. So this is what is now referenced as South Australia, which of course wasn't, it was Pitjantjara country essentially prior to colonisation. And the artists from Spinifex Arts Project are Pitjantjara people. So they, their original kind of place where they lived around near Junjunjara, even though it's now in Western Australia, it's very much, that's all, Pitjantjara, and then to the east is Yankunytjatjara country. So this image you would have seen also on Greg's slide, and I just wanted to reference this work because for me this was one of the first works of art that I saw that was representational, that was looking at the atomic bomb testing directly through the artists of Hilda Mudu and her husband, who's Kumanara Jeffrey Quema. And these two artists were living and working in Oak Valley, which is the community within Maralinga, and a renowned filmmaker, artist, writer, Lynette Walworth, who created the Collisions immersive experience that I hope you all get to see and experience. So Lynette was working for the Adelaide Festival of the Arts in the year 2001, prior to the 2002 Adelaide Festival. The festival director was Peter Sellers, who was an American opera director, and he came to Adelaide as the new festival director, and he proposed to have 9 associate directors, each being paid, and each of those people were from a different region in Australia, and they were tasked with actually finding people and projects that were more community cultural involvement, so that it wasn't a festival where he was just going and travelling the world and bringing theatre productions, music, visual art into the city. It was more about going from the ground up and working with local people. So Lynette went out to the Maralinga community and spoke with them about what they'd like to do, and they said, we want some paint, we want to be able to tell our story about what's happened on our country. So these 2 paintings are a direct result of the workshops and the opportunity that they were given. They've just become icons. These works are constantly being loaned. They're in the collection of the Art Gallery of South Australia. And Hilda Mudu is a really amazing woman who travels from up around Ceduna Way down into Adelaide, into the Riverland of South Australia. She has a lot of family there, so that's a span of about 900 kilometres. We never have a contact for her, but it's like she knows when there's money waiting for her at the gallery because she turns up and it's like, oh yeah, we got that, yeah, we do. Can you please sign this? Do you mind if it goes to Santa Fe? Wherever. Her work has literally travelled the world. So it's been really wonderful to be able to work with her over the years. And that's just, that's no disrespect to her. It's just the way that she lives. She doesn't always have access to a phone or for us to be able to contact her directly. So these are incredible works. I also wanted to make mention of Kumanjara Jonathan Brown, who also was a really incredible artist. He only lived until he was 37 years old. He was someone who was taken away from family at a young age, so he was brought up by non-Aboriginal people far away from where his family were from, the Maralinga Oak Valley region. And when he found his family, he immersed himself in culture, learnt, through family, the Pitjantjara language, and he made some incredible work that I saw at Tandanya National Aboriginal Cultural Institute in my really early days of studying. I was a student at the time and came across this incredible exhibition, which was, I think it was in, must have been around when I started at Tandanya in 1996, I think. And this particular painting was in that exhibition. It was curated by Doreen Mellor, and it was acquired by the Art Gallery of South Australia. But what he's done is he's painted the sacred site from his grandfather, so instructed by his grandfather, and then used that poisoned red earth and, you know, completely obliterated the site with that painting mix. This is an incredible man who also has passed away, and I have got permission from family to be able to show him, Kumanara Willie Kaika Burton. He was a man who was from Amata community working at Jala Arts. Jala is the name for honey ant. And he was one of the main people that was instrumental in starting to reignite the interest in the kulata, the spear-making process with younger men in the community. So this is a cultural maintenance project that has been ongoing for many, many years, that, like as in generations, but had waned somewhat in sort of his lifetime, and so he felt that this is a really important way to be able to bring the young men together with the senior men and for them to be able to learn from each other. So it's, you know, it's a beautiful project. This was one of the first paintings that was done prior to the project really getting underway. And what the men did, so this is a collaborative men's painting. It was in an exhibition that I curated called Heartland alongside of Dr. Lisa Slade, and that was at the Art Gallery of South Australia in 2013. And when we brought the painting in, and he was actually in hospital, and his wife had wheeled him up from the hospital into the gallery, and he said, you know, he had the miru, the spear throwers, and the kulata, the spears, and he said, oh, we've got to put these on the ground. He wanted to put them on the ground, and so we said, oh, we can't really do that, but we'll build a shelf. So we got the carpenter in. It was like the show was about to open. So we built that shelf, and that was to honour the men who had taught him and had come before. And because they were no longer with us, he wanted to lay them down, and their spirit was still with us, but they were resting. And this is a quote that is, yeah, says it all. And what had happened was the men had been, there was a symposium in Alice Springs, which is amazing. It's part of the Desert Mob exhibition that happens every year in September, where desert regions come together into the community of Mbantu or Alice Springs, and they share stories. And it's all honouring all Aboriginal people that are actually sharing their stories. And an artist from Sydney was asked to be a guest speaker, Jonathan Jones, who's an incredible artist, a Wiradjuri artist. And he came along and he was telling the audience about his practice and how he works within, you know, the contemporary art gallery space, and he does installations and a number of, you know, really interesting projects in the way that he researches. And the senior men from Amata, after that presentation, after the symposium, went to speak to Jonathan, and they said, we want to work with you. We've got an idea, and we want to be able to, we think that this is a good way for us to be able to tell our stories. And so from that is where the first iteration of the Kulata Jutta project really kind of came into its own. But I just wanted to show you this photograph. There are 3 different types of wood that are used in making the kulata, the spear. And this curly bush is actually one of the woods that are used. So that is cut and then straightened over heat. So the fire is used to you know, really strengthen and straighten, and that's part of a a process that the men do. There's all sorts of ceremony around that. There's an incredible number of paintings that talk about that. It's a very sacred, very important process. It's something that is, that moment of being able to be together and to do that together and conjuring up the story, and the atmosphere is always alive and electric. So just to see that this ends up being that, incredibly straight arrow of a spear, that is something else. And this is a work that Kumanara Mumu Mike Williams referencing. So these bags that you see hanging off the kulata, off the spear, are mail bags. So for communities outside of the CBD, their mail is collected in and put into these bags are quite large scale, and the mail's put in the bags, and then that goes onto the mail plane, and that's what comes into community. And so as you can see on this bag, you can see Australia, and it's Australia Post. Theft or misuse of this is a criminal offence. Penalties apply. And what he's done is he's transposed country onto that manta. So theft or misuse of this manta, which is land, country, is a criminal offence. So he's turning it back on the Commonwealth, which is just, such a groundbreaking work. It's amazing. And here we have Mr. Burton. So this was the very first iteration of the Kulata Jutta, and it was the Adelaide Biennial of Australian Art. Dark Heart was the name of that exhibition. And it was him working with the younger men to work out the installation, and they had it as you can see it, in like a cube. And in the walls was the sound of the jokulpa, the straightening of the spears. So this incredible recording of that sound you could hear in that space. And you could walk under it. Some people walked under it. I would never have walked under it. Some people laid under it. It's like, oh. And then the next iteration was it was part of a Tarnandy Festival again, and this was Government House, so the grounds of Government House in Adelaide. And the men, during the lead up to native title and land rights in the APY lands, up until native title was granted, and recognition of native title through the Land Rights Act came into being in the early, 1981. So in the lead up to that, the men would come to Adelaide and they would be going in and out of Parliament House. There was a lot of people camped along the river, with the Karawira-Parry, the Red Gum River, which is just behind Government House. So they wanted to have it outdoors at a site that was really important, that helped to sort of show the importance of that time and the amount of work that went into this recognition of their connection to their country. So we went to Government House and asked the governor at the time, Hugh Van Lee, who was actually a Vietnamese refugee from the 1970s, had become our governor, and he was all for it. So it was a one-night-only event. Jonathan helped them and worked with them to create this installation that was a round circle, and all the kulata were attached. I'll just show you that's sort of a close-up of the kulata themselves. You can see how beautiful they are. And then they projected images from that era, from the newspapers of the men. But of course, there were women involved in this as well. And they also did inma, so ceremonial song and dance around that display. And then the next iteration was in Tarnandy in 2017, and this is 550 kulata, so the spears, 550 of the spears. There are 75 artists involved in this particular iteration, from right across the Arningu, Pitjantjatjara, Yunkanjara lands, so 7 different communities of women and men who worked collectively to make this display. So the actual work of the kulata themselves is lit by only one single light source, so you get that sense of the shattering. It's directly referencing the atomic bomb explosion. And then underneath are the piti, so the kulaman. They're wooden bowls that are carved by the women, and they're empty because they're referencing the loss of life, also the loss of food sources. So they would be, the kulamin are used to carry foods that are collected, but also babies. They pop the babies in there to keep them up from the sand, and yeah, so really very powerful work. And the artists performed in-mass ceremonial song and dance for this display. And we've put it up again this year. And this work travelled to the US as part of the political exposure exhibition, Political Ecology. These are three of the women who worked on the actual collada. There are also three of the many women who nominated me for the Order of Australia Award. So they're very important women, and I think quite often get left out from the story. And they've, of course, rallied so hard to enable change to happen in their communities. And one of the main components of this particular display is a 6-channel moving image work, which has recorded stories of women and men who have in their living memory experienced the atomic bomb testing and what has happened to their families. The two women on either side, it's Kumanara Mary Pan and Ilawanti Ken, and Yarachi Young is in the centre. The two women either side, they were brought to Pukacho or Ernabella to the mission there, and they were left by their parents, and then they never saw their parents again. But they had never spoken about that publicly before this moving image work was created, and so it was a moment for them to actually be able to start that grieving process. And that's something that I think has really, it's been really an important part of this process. And this is just to follow up on the work that Greg also showed us with Ioane Scarce. This is her out on country, out at part of Maralinga, Jurritja country. During the making of the Thunder Raining Poison work, that was created for the Tarnandi Festival in 2015, the very first festival. Ioane wanted to, so she works with the associates from the Jam Factory, which is, they have a glass facility, glass-making facility there, and that's where Ioane has done most of her work over the years. And so she wanted the associates to have an opportunity to be able to actually see that country and learn about what it is that they were creating for this installation. And so she took them with her, and I think there were 7 different people that blew these glass yams for this installation, and it's referencing that dissipating bomb cloud. And this was the first iteration of the display, and the one that Greg showed us was this year's. So 10 years later. And that's just a close-up of the yam, because the yam is, an underground root vegetable that is it's a food source right across Australia for most Aboriginal people. It lures you in with that magic, and then you realise what you're looking at is just, terrifying. And these are just, I wanted to show you, this is Harriet Bryant, who is a younger artist, born in 1969, and younger as in she's just started her practice in the last few years. So she is someone who, has learnt about these stories from her family, and she's finding found objects and then painting onto them the stories that have been shared with her. And I think it's really great to see, other people now continuing, because I know when I've spoken to students in the displays of works that people don't know about this history. They don't know anything about it. It's quite terrifying. And then Josina Pamani, born in 1984, is another younger woman, also from Mimili community, who is painting her story of the story that's been passed down to her through her family members, and creating that in these sculptural ceramic forms. Referencing, that black mist on the interior, and then the different sites on the external. But both of these artists are really exciting, and I think, people to watch, and it's just, I think, we need to keep sharing these stories. It's important that they're not lost. But yeah, that's the end of my talk. So thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Nici. We're going to turn to our Q&A, but I'm also going to do an introduction for Tiffany. So we'll call everyone back up to the stage, and Tiffany King is going to moderate our panel, and then we can kind of open it up to a discussion. Tiffany King is Associate Professor in the College and the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences here at the University of Virginia in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And we're so grateful, Tiffany, for your participation, because we really wanted to engage the amazing faculty that we have here at the University of Virginia as well, and to tease out some of the kind of through lines and interdisciplinary threads through all of these different talks. Professor King's work is animated by abolitionist and decolonial traditions within Black studies and also Native and Indigenous studies. She's the author of a really incredible book, The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies from 2020. Read it if you haven't, incredible. And also working on a really amazing sounding forthcoming book, Red and Black Alchemies of Flesh, Conjuring a Decolonial and Abolitionist Now, in which Tiffany turns to the connective threads that bring Black queer feminist and Indigenous Native queer feminist traditions into intimate and erotic relations. One of the things that we're really excited about in partnering with Professor King on this program is that in addition to your two colleagues, Casey Jernigan and Sonia Alcanini, they're directing this really incredible institute here at UVA. It's the Black and Indigenous Feminist Futures Institute, which serves as this incredible hub for cultivating new relationships and strengthening existing ones among scholars, artists, organizers at that intersection of Black and Indigenous life. So a partnership that we hope will continue. So I'll invite you onto the stage and the rest of our speakers. And if you want to say a few words here up at the podium, or here, wherever you feel most comfortable. Thank you. Do you want everyone to come now, or do you want to say
please. Oh, join me.
Everyone join us
By
on
all
stage.
means. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nici and Eleanor, for inviting me to be in community with you, first of all. Yeah, looking forward to a long, fruitful relationship. And also being in conversation with everyone today. These are the kind of days that make me really, really love what I do. So I appreciate y'all. Thank you for attending. I think I'm going to, slow down, because I have so many questions. I feel eager. But I want to pause and make sure that you all get to talk to each other. If you have any questions for each other, comments, words of praise, I want to give a breath. So, and you don't have to, but I just wanted to make sure that I slowed down.
That's okay.
We're good?
What's that?
Are you okay? Is there anything you want to ask? Or?
People often don't get to be in the room with each other, so I don't know if you have spent time with each other, so, We can. We don't have to. We can do it later, too.
Yeah, I think we could.
Okay. I have a question. I have not spent much time in the desert myself. I'm often in relationship with that ecology through representations, usually photography. So I wanted to ask you all about your own individual personal relationships with deserts, desert ecologies, desert as a life force, as a maybe regime of representation, how it's evolving for you. And I thought about you first, Danielle, because I heard you in a conversation with someone, I forget this scholar, about your newest book, and you talking about spending time in the desert, practicing how you write about the desert in your work, how you represent it, right? So I was thinking about that. And then as I was looking at your photography, Will, I was thinking about the conceit and the hubris of the drone and what it promises, right? What we think we can see, not just with the drone, but with various representations about the desert, what in our common sense representations we think we can know, but also if you could talk about what the desert maybe withholds or hides from us based on your own experiences. And then I'm thinking, Nici and Greg, about how your artists challenge some of those common sense or hegemonic representations of the desert as well. Not just through the bombing, but other kinds of techniques, other approaches, right? So if we can start with the desert. Thank you for the water.
Sure. That's a great question. I mean, when I think about the desert, I think of all the sort of attachments, this sort of lifeless space that is available for like the production of the one thing that it can bear, which is like the mineral that you can extract from it, right? Whereas the desert is, this amazing, vital space for so many people who live in those spaces. And just, they're not wastelands. And just the notion of wastelanding as a tool or as a like sort of productive discourse that enables this kind of disposability of a people, of a land, is something that, your question about the drone too is like, the drone has definitely been an instrument in developing that discourse, but then also like trying to use it and reframe it, I think, is something that I'm interested in doing, and still trying to figure out too, like to think a little bit more critically about my own sort of practice, in relation to that. But yeah, I mean, sort of a counter thing, like Diné folks bury their, Diné women bury their umbilical cords, so like we all have this like direct tie to this land and this space in a very physical, like material, spiritual way. So, that's I guess a counter narrative in relation to deserts. It's our life force in some ways.
Well, I'm actually from New England, and so the first time I saw the desert was in a like endless car ride from New England to California to move. And I found it absolutely galvanizing. So I've been really interested in, especially from, being part of a majoritarian culture in a way, the way in which so many imaginaries have been projected on the desert. In Southern California, it's like, was the place in the post-war era of desert modernism. So you could project this notion of glazed boxes that were air-conditioned as the modern way of life. But also the desert in Southern California had a longer history of a place that feminists created imaginaries of new kind of colonies, in a sense. There were lesbian women who started sort of collective homes in the 1920s around what's Palm Springs now. So it's really this amazing collector of imaginaries that are based on the notion that it is a blank canvas and that you can do all kinds of things. And of course, extraction is another projection of a place that's deserted in a sense of life. And what really struck me in Australia, and actually having contact with the desert, going to the desert, is that it is teeming with life. And what I've sort of been able to take from watching Spinifex artists at work is that it's also teeming with life forces, which are really kind of wonderful to see those understandings, lived understandings of the desert continue in the art.
I'm also not originally from a desert area. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and started doing this work from a distance. And over time, through in my field, in rhetorical studies, people don't always go to the places where they're studying. I realized I couldn't do this project without going to the places. And so over a series of visits, and then I happened to get a job at the University of Utah, where I was in very close proximity with one of the waste sites that I was studying. And so just spent so much time there. And I think, just to echo this, maybe growing up, I had these same ideas of the desert as wasteland, desert as lifeless. But as soon as you get there, you see how diverse it is in terms of species, and there's so much water. You just have to know where to find it. There was a study that I used to cite in my work that in terms of species diversity, like Utah and Nevada, which are part of the Great Basin Desert, are like, they're at the top of the charts. They're not number 1 and 2, but they're so high in species diversity, and you kind of have to know where to look. So really, I had to go to that place, and I felt that I couldn't write about this in a respectful and responsible way without being there and also being in conversation with the people. And the thing it makes me think about, because settlers kind of sort of encountered this place, and they encountered difference. And one way that we can respond to difference is to be afraid and to be scared and to put these kind of monikers on it, that this is not the place, and we're going to try and change it, or if we can't change it, we're going to literally make it into a wasteland. But I would much rather approach diversity as a kind of a pool of opportunity and encounters and intercultural dialogue. And so I feel like that's one of the things that we can do as artists and writers, is really shift the way that we encounter spaces that are unknown to us, and take that sort of open, not scared, but open kind of perspective to it.
Set up here. Great question. I feel like in Australia, we have, this whole notion of Australia being beachside. And the majority of the population lives beachside, like around the edges of the country. But the centre of Australia is just outside of the beach. So, for example, if you're in Adelaide, you drive less than 100 kilometres and the dirt turns red. So you're virtually, from the river, you take maybe, 100 metres out from the river, and it's desert. So it's the driest continent. Like it's a really dry country. The whole country is essentially a desert. And that whole notion that people talk about, out back. They say, oh, you've been out back, or you're going out back. It puts it like it's the toilet. Like you're not in the city, you are now out back. And, the toilets used to be out back because the toilet was out the back of the house. So it's just such a misnomer. And for me, I think about that from the artist's perspective, that people talk, and I even hear myself say it sometimes, they live remotely. Remote to what? Where they live is the centre of their universe. And so for me, that's really important to remember, that it's all relative to who we are and where we live and where we're from. And to put to put people in a place where they're remote or they're out back it's rude, it's insulting. And especially because when you yourself are privileged enough to go to these places, you realise how full of life and how full of love and how there is so much to experience and to feel and to be a part of, but only if you are respectful back and that you... So I think that's something that I'm really conscious of, and I try my best not to say those words of remote. The outback thing, because our family are from Broken Hill, that's always been referred to as outback. People in Broken Hill talk about it, or we're outback. But I just, for those reasons, I like to think of it differently. And the artists that I work with, also think of it differently.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, this is truly a Q&A. I do have several more questions, but I do want to take the opportunity to ask people what their questions are and field those. So, please. Yes.
This is primarily for Danielle and Bill. I lived for 20 years in Mexico in the previous millennium when they were building, if you can call it that way, the Waste Isolation Pilot Project outside Carlsbad, New Mexico, which is a geological salt depository for defense nuclear waste. What is the difference in geology for these deposits in Utah and Nevada? And also how deep, because in waste isolation, it's called it's about 2,000 feet underground to make it safe. How is this worked out in Nevada and in Utah?
Yeah. I'll start with Utah. Utah was, the Skull Valley site was intended to be an interim facility, so a place for the waste to go before it goes to final geologic storage. So that was never going to be buried. It was going to be stored above ground in these big engineered casks that would supposedly keep the radiation kind of out of it. And then it would be moved to the national facility waste dump. And Yucca Mountain has a very different geology actually than the WIPP site. The WIPP is kind of a salt cavern site, which internationally actually folks say that that's one of the best ways to contain radiation. So when you do store underground, you already have this cask, and that's one level of containment, and then you have the geographic containment. Yucca Mountain is actually a very seismic and zone. There hasn't been seismicity there in a long time, but when you're thinking about nuclear waste, you have to think a million years in advance, so it could be seismic again. And then because of that, there's actually a lot of water that flows through the mountain. It wasn't going to be buried in the mountain underneath. It's like there's a mountain and they bored holes kind of into the mountain, so not kind of below ground. And part of the reason that it was shown to be not a great site is that it doesn't actually have the same kind of geographic stability that the WIPP does. That it really was chosen for political expediency over the actual scientific kind of elements. And if you look internationally at some of the other sites, they're all putting them into the salt caverns like the WIPP. Even still, these still need to be safely contained for years and years and years. But that is one of the issues that came up with the Yucca Mountain site.
Thank you.
Emma, did I see your hand?
I had a question for Greg. You briefly mentioned that you visited Jishinjara, and I know that was in preparation for this exhibition at the Kluge-Ruhe, and you had spent 14 years collecting these paintings before you actually went to see the land. So I was just wondering how visiting Jishinjara changed your relationship with the paintings.
Well, I guess I have to say that I never expected to visit Jishinjara. It is a restricted site, and you have to have permission to go there. And it was just sort of like the capping of that collecting period that I was able to see it. And, I guess maybe the largest impression it made on me is how even in a community that's considered to be one of the more stable and ordered communities, just how incredibly difficult it is to live there. I mean, just the hardship of living there was, I hadn't really expected that, how hard it was to live. And also, I guess one of the other things that I came to understand, there's this idea in academia that's quite current of object agency, that objects which are inanimate can actually exert agency in the world. And I think what I understood was how alcohol has object agency, and its agency is to extend the powers of colonial destruction. How just alcohol as an inanimate object moves through communities and destroys relationships and people. And that part was terribly sad to realize. otherwise, I have to say. Jishun Jara is very much isolated from, in an attempt to keep the kind of cultural toxins or the literal toxins like alcohol out of the community, but it's still tied to the rest of the world. And yeah, it was kind of, I became awake to the difficulty, and in a sense, you have to say the flip side of it is the heroism of lives that continue despite a continual assault on their culture. I guess that's what was my main response.
Thank you. I like the term, Nici, that you were using as outback, and I was thinking about outsourcing before, but I like the word outback. And then I was thinking about like the side effects of these technologies in three axes that I think you have been discussing today. So one of the side effects on outsourcing and outback projects, for example, in the region I work, is the use of Pacific nuclear technologies to build a replacement for the Panama Canal in the areas that the Kuna people has their territories. So that's one of the examples of using like these Pacific uses of nuclear technologies, but also as an outback and like outback effect of the use of nuclear technologies in the third world. For example, the amount of accidents since the 70s, especially in Guarani and Yanomami territories in Brazil, having like not a clear management procedures for dealing with nuclear waste, and how this affects today and before that the displacement of indigenous population, especially with the uranium mining. But then I was thinking also about ideas of oblivion, and this is the point in which I think it intersects more with the arts, because I think like probably like the arts will help us to fight this idea of oblivion. In many ways, we forgot about like this thing like 50 years ago. Like it sounds like it has happened. I mean, quite old, and especially for new generations like our students that dismissed all technologies in a matter of 5 years, and how we are dealing, for example, with the issues with batteries and cell phones, and we are discarding cell phones that are completely functional, but then like we don't have like clear processes of reusing or discarding lithium. So I was thinking about how, if this is also part of like this idea of the oblivion, and how also, because this is in the context of indigenous knowledge, how academics are also thinking about nuclear colonialism and as an outdated thing, because like nuclear, especially for our new generations, looks like something from the past. So I like this idea of fighting like these ideas of elemental waste through this idea of the nuclear colonialism. But kind of my question is about how much like the classical academia is attacking or putting in like as an outdated framework, like this confrontation of the nuclear colonialism from an indigenous perspective.
Yeah, I think that one of the things actually I really like about Will Wilson's project, the spots of just transition, or what's the title? Connecting the dots of just transition, because it does, I think, exactly what you're asking about. So I do think that, and especially as I teach this, like so much of this history, it's viewed as kind of Cold War, and we're out of the Cold War, and so, you know, there's not maybe a lot of knowledge about this, a lot of desire to think about it, but with that framing of the just transition, it then links nuclear technologies, nuclear energy, but also nuclear weapons technologies to this contemporary movement that's not just about the nuclear technologies, it's about any energy technology and building futures that are just and equitable with the energy choices that we make. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I think it does signal that I might talk about nuclear colonialism to my students or nuclear decolonization to my students, and maybe the light bulb doesn't go off until I start talking about just transition, and I talk about how every energy source that we're considering has, you know, this cradle to grave life cycle, or we talk about President Trump's call to, you know, restart nuclear weapons, or we talk about you know, the linkages between nuclear energy and climate change. So it is almost as if we have to have a slightly different entry point depending on what generation of folks we're talking to about nuclear decolonization.
And Danielle, I mean, in conversations we were having, yes, yeah. I was really struck by your use of this phrase downwinder, and how actually part of it too is helping. So there's this disproportionate way that nuclear testing and mining has affected Indigenous communities and lands all over the world. We're focusing on two geographies, North America and Australia. But actually, because of this relationality, which really comes from this perspective of understanding country as something that is all connected, includes everything under the sun and the sun itself, that we're all affected by nuclear testing, and really helping students to understand kind of their relationship to local histories and to some of these global histories. The fallout on Brisbane, you know, this is something that is inescapable, even though there is this disproportionate effect. So just a comment to say that was such a helpful learning for me in speaking with you and connecting with students, is that this is not something that is just elsewhere, it is everywhere.
Yeah, no, I'll just add that one of my friends, and she's a longtime activist, Mary Dixon, has a map that she takes out with every single person that she sees. And I'm looking at my former student Fiona there, who worked with Mary Dixon and me, that shows the pinpoints of fallout across the U.S. and almost the entire map is black, because they were, you know, black pinpoints for each time there was a period of fallout that could have affected people's health. And then the other thing that happens, another light bulb that goes off when I teach in Utah, and we are downwind of the Nevada test site. And so a generation of, in addition to Indigenous people, like white Mormon folks that lived in this area, are also downwinders and experienced major health effects. And so I teach about this, and then we get to talking about how that caused cancers, and it didn't show up right away. And so it can be hard to know if you were, you know, if the cancer comes from this exposure or thyroid or things like that. And without fail, every semester I have a white Mormon student who then comes to me at the end of class and says, oh my gosh, my mom or my aunt or my grandmother. And yeah, but we have to tell the stories to be able to even get to that sort of moment of someone realizing that this thing that happened, you know, starting in the 50s to the 90s, still has effects on health to this day. And I'm sure the same is true in the communities in Australia. And yeah, and again, Will, your work is also showing these like long-term health effects that come from uranium mining, for example. Sorry.
I just
Go
took
ahead.
it.
I'm so sorry. I was looking at the last hand. Crystal, please. And then I think.
I have a question for Will. I liked that you ended, I think it was at the very end of your lecture, you just had some of your images and some of the images of these remediated sites next to like Michael Heitzer and Robert Smithson. And whenever I teach Robert Smithson, I always also teach the Uruguayan artist Louis Kamnitzer, who compares the spiral jetty to US military carving patterns into the forests of Vietnam using defoliation chemicals. Yeah. So yeah, I just like, and this goes back to Tiffany's question about the desert as empty and not full of life, this idea that we have these mainly East Coast white artists coming into these desert spaces and, creating art out of them as though that's an empty landscape. And so I just want you to elaborate on your, on that kind of amazing comparison that you made.
Yeah, I mean, I just could not see sort of the history of land art after I started photographing the disposal cells. I was like, this is Michael Heiser's city, and then Road and Crater, which is James Turrell's sort of magnus opus that he's been working on forever, right, is at the base of one of our sacred mountains, and I don't think it was done with anybody's permission, I mean, I love myself a skyscape, right? Until I have that, experience, but this is just another level, and I didn't even, intentionally go out to photograph that. I was along the stretch of Little Colorado, and, there's a bunch of mine sites along the way, and I just happened to send my drone out and spin it around, and I was like, whoa, wait a minute, that's Road and Crater, and just a little more narrative about the use of a drone. It's really useful if you're out, I guess, in the country and you don't know which road to take, because there can be multiple roads and they're not great roads. And sending the drone up to decide which way to go to find a place is it's a useful tool for that. But I saw this fence, and it was the nicest fence I'd seen in a long time, and I was like, oh, there's something different about this place. And so yeah, it's when I ran across the Road and Crater, I was like, okay, I have to do this now. And so I had the opportunity. There's the site Santa Fe International Biennial is up right now, and that was the impetus to sort of finish that work that I had been sort of thinking about for a long time. So that's when I got to go through Skull Valley, because I took the sweep from Spiral Jetty to the Sun Tunnels, and then down to, I shot double negative, so I drove down to Las Vegas, and I went through Goshen territory to do that.
Is it Laura? Yeah. There's a question back.
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you all so much. This has given me much to think about, and I really enjoyed all of your talks. But my question definitely ties to the question that Tiffany first asked about relationships with land. I did my master's thesis looking at the Pacific Islands, and so there's this really fabulous Indigenous author who was talking about the fighting colonial conceptions of remote and vast spaces, as though the sea was not also a resource as well. And I guess my question for you all is, how can we shift these narratives or these perspectives? I know that that's maybe not something that we'll be able to do tomorrow exactly, but yeah, how can we push back against these misconceptions?
Rhetoric. Yeah, I think that we have to tell the stories, we have to tell them frequently. I think that, and we have to put a lot of thought into how we're going to tell the stories and frame them. I think that that was a big shift in my own career, where as much as it's so important to understand nuclear colonialism and nuclear colonization as this this kind of structure of harm and structure of violence, that yet it's also really important to kind of think through the modes of survival and think through the joys and the beauty and the brilliance of the ways that folks have survived and lived and thrived even in response to kind of these structures. And so I've really been trying in my own conversations about this, and especially we're living in such difficult times that I think we also, many folks kind of need to hear that it is possible to resist and that there can be wins and there can be kind of, even if you have to remain constantly vigilant, that there can be nuclear waste sites that are stopped, right? There can be a ban on uranium mining on Navajo Nation since 2005. So there's something to me right now about not saying that we can't talk about the harm and the violence, but also like let's let communities themselves lead through their own voices and lead through their own stories of success and hope.
I think it's also thinking really carefully about the language that you use and the way that you talk about people from those areas, and that sort of was how I started thinking about it, was how would I want people to talk about my homeland? It's not sounding right the way that I'm hearing it from other people. So that's what really led me to being, more vigilant about the use of words that I choose. Yeah.
Absolutely. Is there a question?
I would just say,
Will. Sorry, Will.
Create platforms for Indigenous people to talk about, their relationship to land, and I feel like that's been part of my sort of, one of the ways that I work is, through curatorial practice or through teaching or, helping in collaboration to organize a conference or, whatever. Those are really useful ways, I think.
With the microphone, yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you all so much for this amazing panel. And I have a question for all the panelists kind of about reparative justice in the cases of nuclear colonialism. So I study communities that suffered from nuclear testing in Kazakhstan. And I know how hard it is to get reparations still, and I'm less familiar with Australian and North American cases, but because we're talking of the structural violence that's ongoing, right? It's both in the past and in the present and in the future. What models for reparation and reparative justice do you imagine? Do you see any examples that you think are inspirational? Like, what are the challenges? Yes, thank you.
Good question. I've got to be honest, I've seen a few different examples and there's not one that jumps out as being, it kind of, from what I've witnessed myself personally, is that there'll be some reparation to a part of the community and it's quite divisive to the rest of the community. It's divided a lot of language groups in Australia because in order to claim native title in Australia, you have to set up like a prescribed body corporate. So it's like a proprietary limited company. You need a lawyer, you essentially become a private company, and then depending on the advice that you get and depending on what it is that is going on your lands can be quite divisive amongst family. It's not straightforward in Australia, that's for sure. And yeah, I'm not really privy to the information to be able to share it publicly, but
I just know that it's complicated and there isn't one answer.
I think I would echo that, and I would say this is not a model that's currently in practice very much, but land back is for Indigenous communities. I mean, that really is kind of the form of reparation that would really allow for Indigenous-led theories and solutions and actions that give the land back, I think.
The first thing that came to my mind was RECA and its reauthorization, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. I mean, you know, one tiny silver lining in the big atrocious bill, right? Is that got reauthorized, and it was, you know, it was largely Diné women who like were at the forefront of making that happen, and you know, mostly widows of you know, miners who died of cancers. So that's one example, I guess, of a small victory. And I think in the reauthorization, it's like there's a community like after the post-1971 folks are also included in that. I mean, I think it's a pretty limited kind of coverage, like who can apply for it, but it did get a little more expansive. But yeah.
Question in the front.
Thank you all for your talks today, and thank you for moderating this discussion. My question is specifically for Will. I think what stuck out to me was, or a question that's coming up for me is kind of like the evolution of your artistic practice. You talked a lot about starting off with photography and documentary art forms, and it sounds like you've also moved into a really interdisciplinary art form. I was able to go to your installation at the University of Utah with the Hogan, and yeah, you had plants and you had books and you had seeds, and it wasn't just photos, it was this entire experience. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that evolution, if that is accurate or, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's like imagining the possibilities and then making them manifest on at least a small scale, you know, and wanting to like move through that sort of creative practice to bring into the, like, into existence, like this like little space where people could learn and potentially dream up solutions. And maybe there's an opportunity at some point to kind of expand that and make it more. I don't know. I'm a bad delegator. Like, I like to collaborate, but I'm like, I don't know if I'm a control freak or what. I'm just not good at asking people for help, maybe too. But I'm curious. But I think expanding that practice, it would be like the real way to move forward. And that's sort of part of this ongoing collaboration with Diné College. I'm hoping to sort of wake that up soon. It sort of went through a little hiatus in this transition to this new job in Texas. But I'm hoping that with some new funding and sort of like a renewed research agenda under the auspices of Texas, I'll be able to sort of wake that up and do more. But yeah, I think artists are great at like dreaming up solutions for complicated like issues and trying to manifest, you know, some of that. So that's. Yeah.
Hi. I feel so enriched by the conversations that you're offering. And something that's come through, you know, we are on grounds and we have a very recent memorial for enslaved laborers. It's in the shape of a circle. And so I think of the circle that you have with the air
lab. Yeah,
Air lab.
Yeah.
And then I think of the culottes and the Inma and the bowls and the rock holes, of course, and maybe also the craters. You know, I'm just an imagery-led person. So to me, the circles are containers, and we talk about containment. How do we contain the nuclear waste that comes about? So what role do you see circles or these structures, this architecture playing going forward, and how can we continue to protect those who protect the land, and how do we continue to amplify stories of country, of the land?
I think Will put it very well, and you do this in your practice also, Danielle. It's the idea of amplification. I mean, it's certainly not my story to tell, but I can do what I can do, for example, in teaching a college course, to bring people in to tell students who may have be hearing some of these stories for the first time. So it's like whatever you do, you find what platform you actually can use to amplify other voices.
Yeah, I agree. And when doing so, seeking permission when that's appropriate. You know, many of the stories that I tell were because I was working with Indigenous communities that were actively seeking out allyship, actively seeking out connections with folks that were not Indigenous to kind of, in the ways that they could, tell the stories. But I do think, yeah, I mean, it's also not my story to tell. I can tell the stories of my relationships and my kind of connections with place, but being really, making sure that you have permission to tell the stories, and making sure that you're telling them in a way that is hopefully centering the voices and the perspectives of the folks that initially told me the stories.
I would highly recommend going to check out the collisions VR thing. I'm just your idea of circles made me think of that, because it's this 360 experience, right? Even though it's sort of like data technology, it's pretty. It's really well done storytelling, and you're like, you're like in the environment in a way that's. I worked at the Institute of American Indian Art, and they actually have a dome that was meant specifically for that. Like, you don't have to put the headset on; you can be immersed in the environment. And you should definitely talk to those folks and get them to show collisions out there in their dome. I think it would be really cool because you can see it as a group, and like you could bring a whole class and like see it together. It's in Santa Fe at IAI. Yeah.
Folks have, 45 more minutes to see it, Scholars Lab?
Yeah, it's up until 5. Yeah, it's up until 5 if anyone else has a chance. And, if anyone is desperate to and hasn't been able to, we can always try to make a special appointment after it closes today. I had a question. Is that okay if I jump in? Yeah. And Tiffany, you might have more of your own questions. I don't want to take up too much airtime, but going back to your point about the desert, my strongest reaction to Spinifex paintings was just their representation of the kind of like exuberant, joyful celebration of place where the Spinifex artists come from. It's not lost on anyone who walks in the galleries how full of life they are. It's colorful, incredible kind of brushwork that fills every canvas. And it wasn't lost on me as I started to learn about their histories that I wasn't seeing nuclear devastation represented in these canvases. And we've talked about all of this as kind of, it's actually like so relevant in terms of this decolonial narrative of kind of not just focusing on devastation. I think part of what my ill-formed question is about is like representational and rhetorical strategies as they're being deployed to different ends in different places and by different generations. And so, Will, it's like the kind of documentation that you're doing and the importance of recording that, making sure those histories aren't lost, that they're remembered, that they're talked about, that they're communicated even more broadly than they have been, is very different work than what the Spinifex artists were doing, but for different ends, for native title claim, which is different than the kind of archival work and the younger generations that are trying to make sure the stories of their elders are preserved and talked about. So I just wonder if you all could kind of respond to those different strategies and maybe kind of looking to those next generations and where we are going.
Yeah, I think that, I can speak to the rhetorical kind of piece. I think, although I'm, like I said, I'm just so excited to be here because I think art in so many ways is also rhetorical, even if it, maybe isn't for all audiences. And I think that is the challenge of our times, is finding the rhetorical strategies or artistic strategies that maybe reference back to structures and structures of power and structures of racism and colonialism, but not kind of get us stuck in that. And then how do we always or how might an artist always try to present the beauty of place, I was thinking about how, because I saw the exhibit this morning, it really, just as we were all talking about, you could never come out of that exhibit not thinking that these places are full of life and full of diversity of species and all of that sort of thing. So I don't know. I don't think I have a great answer. I think your point is such a good one that, both rhetoric and representation can take all of these different forms and can, and not one single one is going to kind of move us along towards restorative justice or decolonization or land back. We kind of need a lot of them happening at the same time.
And I think one of the things that I've been really hoping to support throughout the work that I've been doing in the last 17 years is about providing opportunity, because there are so many people that are making work that don't really have a platform for that work. So I really believe in that community cultural development support, that, those terms can be, become outdated and people just think, it's, community projects, but it's not. For Aboriginal communities and people living in cities, and people who don't have that opportunity or that access to a fine art community or a way to be able to exhibit and make work getting ready to exhibit, that is where the gold is for me. I've seen there are so many artists that have stories, they have familial stories, they have connection to their jukapa, to their ancestral stories, that just don't get a chance. So I feel like trying to help provide more of those opportunities, more people need to be able to be investing and supporting artists to be able to tell those stories. And that's a way for us to all learn more about those connections to place and to these histories or her stories that are happening and that have happened. And, seeing the last two works that I showed of Harriet Bryant from Mimili and also Josina Pamani, Josina said that she's heard these stories her whole life, and her uncle, Yami Lester, was born blind. He was born as a result of the atomic bomb testing in their community and in Emu Field, the fallout from Emu Field. So that's, that's a direct response. And Josina hasn't had a chance to make work like that up until the last couple of years. and that's because of an opportunity in Adelaide. She moved to Adelaide and she's been working at the collective and creating ceramics. So, you know, I just think that we need to be able to have more outreach into communities, people who are very active in their own way in their family stories, but how can we provide opportunities for them to share those stories?
You don't have to, Will. I was looking at you intensely, but it's fine.
A new crop of artists are representationally advanced. I mean, one thing that's happened recently, at least with the Diné situation with uranium, Shayla Blatchford, she's a young sort of documentary trained photographer, has put together this amazing resource called the Anti-Uranium Mapping Project. And it's deep research, around that. And, you know, she's also a super talented photographer. So she's got like a touring exhibition that's kind of built around this idea and issue. I don't know. I mean, there's a ton of scholarship, you know, there's like a whole new generation of Indigenous scholars, you know, and this NASA movement has really, I think, shifted the grounds in terms of scholarship around just things related to Indigenous, you know, beyond what we're talking about. That's really exciting. And I mean, Mellon has all of these initiatives in different sort of major museums or institutions where they're supporting curatorial fellows now who are coming from these communities to kind of create this sort of next generation of information.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Do remarks, final remarks? Yeah. So we can do, I don't have a final remarks other than thank you so much. And thank you for, but I do want a round of applause. Yeah, we'll do that for, we're at 4:22. Is there a final pressing question? Okay. I guess let's talk and finish the coffee and make your way to Scholars Lab if you haven't seen Collisions. But thank you again.